The surgeon had the blade in his hand. The consent form was signed. The Navy captain's arm was black from shoulder to wrist, and every monitor in the operating room was screaming. 6 minutes. That was how long it would take to remove the limb permanently. 6 minutes, and the man would wake up missing everything below the left shoulder. Then the captain opened his eyes, turned his head past the surgeon, past the anesthesiologist, past the 3 senior nurses hovering at the table, and found the one woman standing alone against the back wall. His cracked lips moved. He lifted 2 fingers from the gurney and pressed them to his brow in a shaking salute. "Valkyrie," he whispered, "don't let them take my arm." Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit subscribe right now. This channel runs long-form stories every week. Military drama, medical thrillers, stories about people who were written off and came back swinging. You don't want to land in the middle of one of these blind. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me your city or your country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. All right, let's go back to the beginning. Kira Langston had been at Hargrove General Hospital in Spokane, Washington, for exactly 91 days when she learned that invisibility, in the right circumstances, was not a weakness. It felt like one. Every morning, she clocked in at 6:50, changed into scrubs in the corner locker room stall that nobody else wanted because the latch was broken, and walked the East Wing corridor to the nurses' station, where her assignment board was already stacked before she arrived. The hard cases, the messy discharges. The patients who had been flagged as difficult, combative, non-compliant, unpleasant, the ones the senior nurses quietly redistributed before the shift officially started so the work landed on. Whoever was least likely to push back. Kira didn't push back. She was 32 years old, with dark circles under gray eyes and hair that she pulled back so tight it looked intentional, like armor. She moved through the ward the way water moves around, furniture efficient, almost silent, present, without demanding to be noticed. The other nurses had stopped bothering to include her in the break room conversations after the first 2 weeks, not because they disliked her exactly. More because she didn't offer much, didn't complain, didn't gossip, and there's only so long you can maintain interest in a person who gives you nothing to work with. Dr. Preston Hale had formed his opinion of her inside the first 10 days. Hale was a cardiothoracic surgeon with a reputation that preceded him down every hallway he entered. He was 47, athletic in the way that suggested a personal trainer rather than any real physical discipline, and he wore his seniority the way some men wore expensive watches not for function, just to be certain everyone clocked it. He had a specific way of addressing nurses that was technically polite and substantively contemptuous, direct eye contact, short sentences, a slight upward tilt of the chin that made everything he said sound like a correction. Ward 7 needs a chest drain checked, he told Kira on her 3rd morning, not because it was her assignment, but because she happened to be nearest. He didn't wait for her response. He was already moving. She checked the drain. It was her job. She did it well and documented it and said nothing. By the end of the first month, Hale had decided she was a competent technician and nothing more. He stopped addressing her by name, not deliberately, she thought. Just the natural bureaucratic erosion that happened when a person failed to distinguish themselves. She became the nurse in 11, or someone get me a 16 gauge, or simply a hand, he pointed at it, when he needed something retrieved. The senior nursing staff had their own hierarchy, and Kira occupied none of it. Charge Nurse Deborah Weston was the fulcrum around which the East Wing rotated. She was 51, 23 years at Hargrove, and she had the particular authority of someone who knew exactly where every body was buried, because she had helped dig several of the holes. She was not unkind to Kira in the way you could point to. She just allocated. The worst night shifts went to Kira. The most understaffed sections, the most complex post-surgical patients who required the most documentation, the rooms at the far end of the wing where call buttons took longer to reach, and families were more likely to be agitated by the wait. Weston assigned these things to Kira without commentary, and Kira accepted them without commentary, and neither of them ever said aloud what the arrangement actually meant. What it meant was, you are here to absorb the work that nobody else wants, and in exchange, we will not make your life actively difficult. Kira had known worse arrangements. She had applied to Hargrove General because it was from Billings, Montana, where she had spent the previous 18 months convincing herself she was building something stable. She had left Billings because the hospital director there had discovered, through channels she still hadn't fully traced, that her employment history had gaps. Significant ones. She had left the position before he could ask the questions she wasn't ready to answer. Before Billings, there had been a clinic in Missoula. Before Missoula, 18 months of nothing, of small towns and cash jobs, and a deliberate grinding effort to become someone unremarkable. She was good at it by now. Unremarkable. Quiet. A nurse who did the hard work and didn't ask for credit. What she could not fully suppress, and what occasionally surfaced in ways she had to manage carefully, was the knowledge underneath. 3 years of civilian nursing on top of something else, entirely something she had spent considerable effort filing away. In a part of herself she tried not to open. On a Tuesday in late October, that door opened anyway. The trauma bay at Hargrove General was not a large room, but it was a loud one. When the ambulance call came in at 11:14 in the morning, Kira heard it from the medication prep station, where she was pulling charts, a Navy officer, mid-40s, transferred from a regional clinic after presenting with acute vascular compromise in the left upper extremity. The medics had initially suspected crush injury. The clinic had suspected compartment syndrome. The transport team had administered vasoconstrictors en route, which, depending on what was actually happening inside that arm, was either appropriate or catastrophically wrong. Kira set down the chart she was holding. She wasn't assigned to trauma. Weston had made that clear. In the second week, East Wing, post-surgical recovery. That was Kira's section. The trauma bay had its own staff, its own hierarchy, its own attending physicians who didn't want unfamiliar nurses materializing in their workspace without invitation. She went anyway, not rushing. She walked at a normal pace, badge clipped, hands empty. She came through the trauma bay door as the gurney was being locked into position and stood near the supply wall, out of the way, and looked at the man on the table. His name was on the transport tag, Captain Marcus Devereaux, United States Navy. He was big, broad through the chest, the kind of build that comes from actual physical work rather than a gym, and his left arm from the shoulder to the wrist had turned the color of a bruise that had been bruising for days. Deep blue-black at the center, fading to purple at the edges, with a swollen, tight appearance that told Kira what she needed to know before anyone in the room had said anything she considered accurate. Arterial occlusion, probable thrombosis, Dr. Hale announced, pulling on gloves. He had taken the case because his colleague was in surgery and Hale had been available. We're going to need vascular. And get me imaging. Imaging's backed up 40 minutes, someone said. Then we don't wait. I'm looking at this arm, and I'm telling you, the tissue is non-viable. We need to prep for... It's not dead tissue. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone has said something that violated an understood social order. Everyone turned. Kira was still standing near the supply wall. She hadn't moved. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply said what she saw. Hale turned slowly. He looked at her with the expression of a man identifying an unexpected obstacle, not alarmed, not particularly angry yet, just recalibrating. Excuse me? The skin coloration and the swelling pattern are consistent with a pressure-induced vascular emergency, Kira said. Not tissue death. If you do imaging, you'll likely see a blockage that's external rather than... You're in the wrong bay. Hale's voice was pleasant. That was the thing about him he was pleasant when he was doing this. East Wing Recovery is your section. I know. Then you understand you need to leave. The vasoconstrictors they gave him in transport narrowed the vessels. If there's a fascial pressure component, and you've compounded it with the medication Minence. Security, Hale said, not loudly. Just said it, like a reflex. You'll be cutting off a healthy arm. The words landed in the middle of the room. Hale set down the chart he'd picked up. He looked at Kira for a long moment, and what crossed his face wasn't exactly anger. It was something more specific than anger, the expression of someone who is very certain they are right and is choosing how to handle the interruption. I am a surgeon, he said. I have 17 years of vascular and cardiothoracic experience. You are a floor nurse who wandered out of your assigned section. He paused. Do you have something in your RN training that I am missing? The room was watching. 4 nurses, 2 residents, the scrub tech, the anesthesiologist, who had been hanging a bag and had stopped. Kira could feel it, the specific weight of a room waiting for someone to back down. She looked at Hale. I have seen this injury before. The treatment is a fasciotomy to release the pressure. If you cut that arm off, you will find out in the lab results that the tissue was viable. I'm telling you now because the lab results will come back after the surgery and the arm will already be gone. Hale picked up his chart again. Escort her out, he told the nearest resident. The resident took a step toward Kira, and Captain Marcus Devereaux opened his eyes. He was heavily sedated. The transport team had noted that in the paperwork he'd been administered enough to keep him under for the transfer. His oxygen had been dipping in the ambulance, and there had been concern about his pain response. He should not have been conscious. He probably wasn't fully conscious. He probably wasn't fully conscious in the way that would hold up in a legal sense. But his eyes opened, and they found Kira across the room the way eyes sometimes find a familiar face in a crowd, that involuntary lock that has nothing to do with logic. His right hand came up from the gurney, slow, shaking slightly, the IV line pulling taut. 2 fingers pressed to his brow, a salute. The room did not understand what it was watching. The resident stopped moving. The anesthesiologist actually leaned forward. Devereaux's lips barely moved. His voice was almost nothing, a dry, cracked thread of sound. Valkyrie. Kira went very still. He had to stop and breathe. The monitors spiked and settled. Don't let them take my arm. Then his hand dropped back to the gurney, and his eyes closed, and the room was absolutely silent. Hale broke it first. He looked at Kira. Whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes, it lasted about 4 seconds. Who are you? He asked, and this time the question had a different weight. Kira Langston, she said. East Wing Recovery. That man just called you something else. She didn't answer that. How does a Navy captain know you? Kira crossed the room. She moved to the gurney and put her hand on Devereaux's arm carefully, measuring the pressure along the compartment boundary, finding the area of maximum tightness. She looked up at Hale across the table. How long before you can get vascular on the phone? Hale stared at her for a moment. 20 minutes minimum. Do you want to wait 20 minutes on an arm that might still be viable, or do you want to start the procedure that gives him stas at keeping it? She kept her voice level. She was not arguing. She was presenting him with a practical question, the same way you'd present any experienced clinician with a practical question. When time was the variable, nobody could afford to waste. Your call. You're the surgeon. Something shifted in the room. It was subtle, the residents, exchanging a look. The scrub tech, straightening slightly. Hale was watching Kira's hands, the way she was reading the arm, the specific landmarks she was pressing that indicated she knew exactly what she was looking for. If you're wrong, he said, you understand what that means for you. I'm not wrong. You could lose your license. She met his eyes. Yes. The anesthesiologist quietly said, the arm is still showing some capillary response at the distal end. I didn't mention it because I thought we were leaning toward amputation, but minus. Show me, Hale said. He moved to the other side of the gurney. He looked where the anesthesiologist indicated. He looked at Kira. His jaw tightened. What's the fasciotomy procedure for this specific compartment presentation? He asked. Testing her, she told him. Not quickly, not showing off, just the sequence, the landmark, the release points, the post-procedure monitoring parameters. She recited it the way someone recites a route they've driven 100 times in the dark. Hale was quiet for 10 seconds. Prep her, he said to the scrub tech. She's assisting. The procedure took 47 minutes. Kira made the initial incision at the fascial plane, guided by the pressure mapping she'd done manually before they even got the ultrasound positioned. Hale watched. He interjected twice corrections that were technically valid but unnecessary, the kind of adjustments that established hierarchy rather than improved the outcome. And then he stopped interjecting and just watched. When the compartment released, the change was immediate. The pressure equalized. The swelling began to redistribute. And over the next 4 minutes, as the arterial flow returned and the vessels that had been compressed for hours began to move blood the way they were supposed to move blood, the skin of Captain Marcus Devereaux's arm shifted from blue-black to purple to a deep mottled red. Pink at the fingers first, then creeping upward. One of the residents made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The arm was viable, every centimeter of it. Hale stood at the head of the table and looked at the arm and then at Kira. She was already irrigating the wound, focused on the next step, not looking at him, not looking at anyone. She had known what the outcome would be before she walked through the door. He said nothing. The circulating nurse said, under her breath, to no one in particular. She just saved that arm. They moved Devereaux to post-surgical recovery 2 hours later, which put him back in Kira's section. Not intentional, the bed allocation was a logistics decision made by the floor coordinator, but that was where he ended up. And so Kira was his nurse again in the most official sense. He regained full consciousness at around 3 p.m. She was checking his IV line when he came back, surfacing the way people do from surgical sedation. Slow, confused, tactile. His first clear action was reaching down toward his left arm with his right hand and finding the bandaged limb still attached to his body. His exhale was the kind that doesn't have words. Easy, Kira said. He turned his head and found her. You're real, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. You're in Hargrove General. Spokane. She made a note on his chart. Your arm is intact. The surgery went well. You'll need several weeks of recovery and physical therapy. But the vascular team confirmed tissue viability in all compartments. He was watching her with the particular attention of someone who is filing information carefully, checking it against something internal. You don't remember me, he said. Not a question. We've never met. She didn't look up from the chart. Fort Lannar, he said. Eastern Afghanistan. 3 years ago. The ambush on the Korangal Valley supply route. Kira's pen stopped moving. She had heard the name. She had been trying, for 3 years, to hear it as little as possible. I had shrapnel in my chest and a collapsed lung, Devereaux said. My team was down. The medevac was 40 minutes out. There was a medic. He paused. She kept me alive. She had a call sign. The guys called her Valkyrie. Kira set the pen down. She adjusted his IV line, which didn't need adjusting. Was buying herself the 3 seconds she needed to make a decision. You should rest, she said. Your pain medication. Well, Sergeant Emily Mercer, he said quietly. The name hit her somewhere between the sternum and the throat. She kept her face still. She had practiced this. She had practiced it in mirrors and in empty rooms, and in the moments before sleep when old names surfaced like flotsam. I don't know that name. I do. He wasn't pushing. His voice was even careful, the voice of a man who understood that he was handling something breakable. I know the face. I remember what she looked like leaning over me in the dark, telling me to breathe. He glanced at her hands. The scar on your left wrist. That's from the shrapnel. I saw it happen. Kira said nothing. I spent 2 years trying to find her, he said. The records were sealed. Her file was restricted. The people in my chain who I asked about it got very quiet and said there was nothing to find. He shifted slightly in the bed, and she watched the pain cross his face and settle. Then I wake up, and you're standing against the wall, and I thought. He stopped. I thought I was dreaming. She picked up her pen, looked at his chart, did not look at him. You need to rest, Captain. Kira Langston doesn't exist before 4 years ago, he said. I checked when I was clear-headed enough to think about what I'd seen. A new license, a new employment history, a social security record that holds up to casual inquiry but stops cold if you look at it sideways. A long pause. Someone built that identity for you. I need to update your medication schedule. I'm not going to tell anyone, he said. Whatever happened, whatever you're running from, I owe you my life twice now. I don't throw that away. He looked at the ceiling. But I need you to know that I remember. And I'm grateful. That's all. Kira finished the medication note. She clipped the chart back to the end of the bed. She smoothed the edge of the chart cover in a gesture she was not aware. She was making an unconscious, compulsive neatness that had belonged to a different version of herself. I'll be back at 6 to check your vitals, she said. She was almost at the door when he spoke again. Valkyrie. Just the word, nothing else. She pushed through the door without turning around. The rest of the shift moved the way shifts do when you're maintaining a surface that requires constant management. She checked her other patients. She completed her documentation. She responded to Weston's request to cover a bathroom break for the nurse in room 14. She did these things with the same efficiency she always brought, and no one watching her would have seen anything unusual in her face or her hands or the way she moved through the ward. Inside, she was running damage control on something she had believed, with increasing confidence over the past 3 years, that she had successfully buried. Valkyrie was a call sign she had carried for 14 months of active deployment. She had earned it the way call signs get earned, not by choosing it, but by being assigned it after a specific event, a night op in Kandahar province, where she had treated 11 casualties under fire without a clear perimeter, moving between positions, carrying the field kit that weighed 38 pounds, doing the work while the exchange was still happening around her. 11 soldiers, 9 survived. The 2 who hadn't made it had not died because she was absent. They had died because the injuries had been catastrophic in ways that no medic with a field kit and no surgical suite could address. She knew this. The after-action report knew this. The evaluation by the battalion surgeon knew this. What the evaluation didn't know, and what she had spent 3 years trying to forget, was what it had felt like to make the choice. To look at a man with injuries beyond the reach of what she could do and move to the next one. To triage, to decide, to live with having decided. That was the thing about the call sign. It didn't mean what people thought it meant. She had her break at 4:30. She went to the locker room, sat on the bench in the corner stall with the broken latch, and put her head back against the metal. She allowed herself 4 minutes of just breathing. This was a practice she had developed a fixed, finite duration for the pressure to exist before she needed it back under control. 4 minutes, no more. At minute 3, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She had a specific protocol for unknown numbers. She didn't answer them. She watched the call go to voicemail. A minute passed. A notification appeared. She opened the voicemail. The voice on the recording was male, controlled, accented in a way she couldn't immediately place mid-Atlantic, possibly military background, the flat precision of someone who had learned to use language as a tool rather than an expression. Sergeant Mercer. We know you're in Spokane. We know you were the lead medic on the Fort Lanner deployment. We know about the mission and what you were responsible for. We also know Captain Devereaux is alive because of you, which means you've now attracted exactly the kind of attention you spent 3 years avoiding. A pause. There are people who want answers for what happened in the Korengal Valley. They are not interested in the official record. And they know where you work. The call ended. Kira sat with the phone in her hand for the remaining 40 seconds of her 4-minute break. Then she put the phone in her pocket, stood up, straightened her scrubs, and walked back out to the ward. At 5:47 p.m., she went to check on Captain Devereaux and found his room crowded with people she had not seen before: 2 men in civilian clothes who had the posture of military without the uniform, standing near the window, and a woman in a charcoal blazer who was reading from a tablet and looked up when Kira entered. The woman looked at Kira's badge, then at Kira's face. "Are you Kira Langston?" she asked. "Yes. My name is Major Diane Forsyth, Army JAG Corps." She closed the tablet. "We need to talk about who you actually are." Devereaux, from the bed, looked at Kira. His expression carried something that might have been an apology, or might have been a warning. The 2 men by the window had positioned themselves near the door. Major Diane Forsyth had the kind of stillness that came from years of interviewing people who were trying to decide how much of the truth they could afford to give away. She didn't move toward Kira. She didn't move away. She simply stood near the foot of Devereaux's bed with the closed tablet against her chest and waited. The way someone waits when they already know the answer and are interested only in how long the other person will take to stop pretending they don't. Kira looked at the 2 men by the door, then at Devereaux, then back at Forsyth. "This isn't a good place for this conversation," Kira said. "No," Forsyth agreed, "but it's the one we have. The captain informed us you were on staff here. We've been looking for Sergeant Emily Mercer for 14 months. I told the captain," Kira said, carefully, "that I don't know that name. And he told us you'd say that." Forsyth's voice was even, no edge to it, no particular urgency. "He also told us what you did in that operating room this morning. The fasciotomy, the compartment diagnosis without imaging." She paused. "A floor nurse in East Wing Recovery doesn't do that. An Army Ranger combat medic who logged 4 deployments and a citation for battlefield surgical intervention under fire, that person does that." Kira said nothing. "We're not here to arrest you," Forsyth said. "We're not here to expose you. I need you to understand that before anything else gets said in this room." "Then what are you here for?" Forsyth glanced at Devereaux, who had been quiet. He gave a small nod, the kind that passes information between people who have already had the version of this conversation that happens before the official one. "Captain Devereaux's transfer to Hargrove wasn't random," Forsyth said. "He requested it when he identified this hospital's location relative to an address we'd flagged. He had a theory about where you might be. He was right." Kira felt something shift in the architecture of the situation. The way a room feels was different when you realized the door you thought was behind you is actually across the room. "He came here looking for me. He came here because he had a chest infection that required monitoring. And this was the nearest facility with adequate capacity," Forsyth said. "The arm was a separate and genuinely coincidental emergency. The infection was real. The transfer was legitimate." She allowed a pause. "The timing was not coincidental." Devereaux said, "From the bed, I'm sorry. I didn't plan on the arm." "Nobody plans on the arm," Kira said flatly. "I needed to find you," he said. "Not for JAG. Before Forsyth, before any of this, I just needed to find you, because you saved my life in a ditch in Afghanistan and then disappeared off the face of the earth, and I couldn't—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together. "I needed to know you were alive." The room held that for a moment. Kira looked at the wall above his bed. There was a water stain near the ceiling that she had noticed on her first visit to this room 3 weeks ago when the previous patient had been a 70-year-old woman recovering from a hip replacement. She had cataloged it. Then, the way she cataloged everything, automatic, compulsive, the habit of noting details in case the details mattered later. "What does JAG want?" she asked Forsyth. "Information. Specifically about the Fort Lanner deployment and the events of March 14th, 3 years ago." Forsyth took a breath. "There's an open investigation. It's not about you, Sergeant. You are not the subject of the investigation. But you are, according to every surviving member of your unit who has spoken to us, the most significant witness to what happened that night. That investigation has been open for 3 years, Kira said. Nobody contacted me. You were not findable, Forsyth said. And there were people within the chain of command who had an interest in keeping you that way. That landed differently than anything else Forsyth had said. Kyra turned it over. What does that mean? It means the sealed file wasn't sealed for your protection. Forsyth uncrossed her arms and set tablet on the side table, a gesture that read as deliberate setting down a barrier. It means someone with authority over that record made the decision to classify your service history and then removed themselves from the paper trail. We have the redactions. We don't yet have the name behind them. She looked at Kira steadily. We think you might. Before Kira could respond, Captain Devereaux's monitor changed. It was not a dramatic sound. Monitors in a hospital room produce a range of alerts, some urgent, most not, and the staff develops a calibrated response to each frequency and cadence. This one was the kind that required a second look, not the alarm of a critical failure, but the preliminary shift of a rhythm moving somewhere it shouldn't. Kira heard it and was at the bedside in the same motion, 2 steps and a reach for his wrist before she had consciously decided to move. His pulse was wrong. Not absent, not crashing wrong in the specific way that had a specific name. A name she had learned from a flight surgeon in Bagram who had drilled her on it until she could identify it by feel before the machine confirmed it. Has he had any respiratory complaints today? She asked the room. Not Forsyth. The question went outward to anyone who might have the answer. He mentioned tightness this morning. One of the men by the door said, he had a face that suggested he was the one who paid attention to things. Before you came on shift, I noted it as post-surgical discomfort. Tightness where? Right side. He said it felt like pressure. Kira straightened and pulled the stethoscope from her pocket. She put it to Devereaux's right chest wall and listened. Then the left. The comparison was immediate and unambiguous. Get me a large bore needle, she said. 14 gauge. And someone get Hale or whoever is on surgical call right now. What's happening? Forsyth said. Tension pneumothorax. His right lung is collapsing. She was already palpating the second intercostal space, finding the landmark with the efficiency of someone who had done this before in conditions where the landmarks were harder to find, because people were shooting at her. If I wait for the surgical team, he arrests. So I need the needle in the next 90 seconds. One of the men by the door moved. He wasn't a hospital person, but he moved well, purposefully, and he was out the door before the sentence fully ended. The other one pulled out a phone. Forsyth said, very quietly, Can you do this? Kira looked at her. Yes. The nurse who appeared in the doorway 40 seconds later was a young man named Garrett, second year on the ward, who had the expression of someone who had heard something concerning and wasn't sure who was in charge of responding to it. He had the Kit Hargrove kept procedure trays in the medication room at the end of the hall. Standard configuration. Kira talked him through what she needed, with her hands already moving. She had the angle, the landmark, the insertion point. She felt the resistance, and then the release, the specific tactile pop of a needle entering pressurized space and allowing the trapped air to escape. The monitor changed its tone within 30 seconds. Devereaux exhaled audibly, and his color, which had been going wrong in ways she'd been tracking since she positioned herself at the bedside, began to come back. Garrett said in a voice that was trying to be professional and not quite making it, How did you? Get the surgical team and tell them we need a chest tube, Kira said. He needs definitive management, not just the needle. Go, he went. Devereaux was looking at the ceiling, breathing with the careful concentration of someone who has just been reminded that breathing is not automatic. Twice, he said. That's twice in one day. Don't talk. I know. But he stopped and breathed. Twice. Forsyth had pressed herself back toward the wall during the procedure and now came forward again. Her face had changed in a way that was difficult to name, not shock exactly, but the recalibration of someone who has just watched a piece of information become undeniable. "You didn't hesitate," Forsyth said. Kira was checking Devereaux's pressure. Hesitating kills people. I've been in rooms with surgeons who hesitated on that call. They're not bad at their jobs. It's just... Forsyth paused. That was a combat medic's read. Speed and certainty. That doesn't come from an RN program. Kira said nothing. Emily, Forsyth said quietly. Not Sergeant Mercer. Just the name. We need you. Not because JAG needs a witness, though it does. Because there are people inside that investigation who have been using your absence as a reason to close threads that need to stay open. If you stay disappeared, the story ends in a way that's wrong. Kira finished the pressure check. She noted the reading and wrote it on the back of her glove, a habit that required no thought, the habit of someone who had documented things in conditions where paper wasn't available. She looked at Devereaux. He was stable, breathing, watching her with the eyes of someone who was waiting to see what she did. "I'll talk to your team," she said, "after he's properly managed." Dr. Preston Hale arrived 14 minutes later, having been pulled from a consult in another wing. He came through the door, reading from a tablet, already composed, already prepared to take charge of whatever situation needed taking charge of. He stopped when he saw Kira standing at the bedside with a needle decompression already completed and a patient in stable condition. She identified a tension pneumothorax. Garrett said from behind him, somewhat helpfully and somewhat not. Hale looked at the monitor, at Devereaux, at the procedure tray, at Kira. He went through this circuit twice, in the way of someone trying to construct a picture that fits the available evidence. "The needle placement is textbook," he said, not to Kira, to Garrett. "She did it in under a minute," Garrett said, "before I even got the kit open." Hale set down his tablet. He examined the insertion point, examined the monitoring data, checked Devereaux's breath sounds himself. He did all of this without speaking. When he was done, he stood straight and looked at Kira with an expression that was unfamiliar on his face, not the calibrated authority, not the pleasant contempt. Something else. "We'll take over from here," he said. "He needs a chest tube." "Yes," Kira agreed. He stopped. Started again. "You caught that from a vitals read." And breath sounds. The asymmetry was significant. He was quiet for a moment. "You were right this morning." "About the arm." "I know." He pressed his mouth flat. Whatever he was about to say cost him something. "I dismissed you inappropriately, and I was wrong to do it." It was not a generous apology. It was abbreviated and partial, and he delivered it the way a man delivers something he's decided must be done, because the logic of the situation has forced his hand. But it was there, in the room, said out loud in front of witnesses, and Kira accepted it for what it was. "Get him the chest tube," she said. "That's what matters." She stepped back and let Hale's team take the position at the bedside, which was what had to happen next. She stood near the wall, the same wall she'd been standing against this morning. She realized in the trauma bay and watched the procedure begin. What happened in the next hour happened quickly, and then slowly, and then quickly again, in the way that significant things happen when they have been building for a long time beneath a surface that looked stable. Forsyth's 2 officers made calls from the hallway. Hale's team managed Devereaux's chest tube. Kira stood in the corridor between these 2 activities and existed in the space where she was no longer quite invisible and not yet anything else. Deborah Weston found her there. Weston had clearly been briefed on something not fully, but enough. She had the expression of a woman who is recalculating a relationship she thought she had correctly mapped. "The administrator wants to know what's going on in room 9, she said. 2 emergency interventions on a Navy patient, Kira said. Both successful. The Army officers in the hallway. Not my area. Weston looked at her for a long moment. "Are you in trouble?" It was possibly the most direct question Weston had ever asked her. In 3 months of working together, of Weston allocating the hard shifts and Kira absorbing them without complaint, this was the first time Weston had asked her anything that wasn't logistical. Kira recognized this for what it was. Not affection, not concern exactly, but the first acknowledgement that the arrangement between them had been built on a version of Kira that was incomplete. "No," Kira said, "not the kind you're thinking of." Weston processed this. She looked at the army officers down the hallway. "The administrator also wants to know who authorized you to perform procedures in trauma this morning and in room 9 this afternoon." "Nobody authorized me," Kira said. "I did it anyway." Weston's expression did something complicated, and the patient is alive. Both times. Another long look. Then Weston said, without warmth, but without the bureaucratic distance either, "I'll tell the administrator the procedures are being reviewed." "That's fair." Weston walked away, and Kira watched her go, and registered that something small but real had shifted there. Not fixed, nothing fixed, but shifted. Forsyth conducted the formal conversation in a conference room on the second floor at 7 p.m. after Devereaux was stable and settled, and Kira had handed off her remaining patients at the end of shift. The 2 officers she learned their names were Specialist Avery and Captain Lund, and they were from a military investigative unit she had heard of but never interacted with, sat on one side of the table. Forsyth sat at the head. Kira sat alone on the other side with a cup of bad hospital coffee that she didn't drink. "I'm going to tell you what we know," Forsyth said, "and then I need you to tell me what we've missed." What they knew was substantial. They had the original deployment orders for Fort Lanark. They had the after-action reports, including the ones that had been filed after Kira's unit had been ambushed on the Karangal Valley supply route. They had survivor testimonies from 4 members of her unit who had been found and debriefed in the 18 months following the incident. They had 2 years of investigative work by a team that had been assembled quietly without the involvement of the conventional chain of command, because the conventional chain of command was part of what they were investigating. What they didn't have was the decision architecture, the mechanism, the person or people who had sent the convoy into a route that had been flagged in internal communications that Forsyth laid out on the table in printed form, 24 pages of intelligence assessments that had circulated in the weeks before the ambush. The route was known. The threat assessment was documented. And someone had sent the convoy anyway. 7 soldiers died, Forsyth said. You treated 11 casualties in real time. 9 survived, including Captain Devereaux. The 2 who died, Corporal Dennis Warwick and Private First Class Alyssa Tremblay, died of injuries that were beyond field intervention. Your after-action report was clear on that. The battalion surgeon's review confirmed it. She paused. You did not fail them. I want to say that clearly, because I think you have been carrying something for 3 years that does not belong to you. Kira looked at the table, not at the documents, at the grain of the table surface. The question, Forsyth continued, is why your file was sealed, why your identity was reclassified, and why, when Devereaux began asking questions through his own command about the medic who had saved his life, the inquiry was shut down at a level 3 pay grades above his rank. She looked at Kira steadily. Someone wanted you unavailable. Do you know why? Kira was quiet for a moment. Then I saw something before the ambush. The room adjusted, not physically, but in the way rooms adjust when the information that has been missing arrives. Tell me, Forsyth said. On the morning of the 14th, Kira said, I was at the forward operating base running a supply inventory for my medical kit. I went to the communications tent to request a resupply form. There was a briefing happening. I wasn't supposed to be there, and whoever was conducting it didn't know I was outside the canvas. I heard 2 voices. One was the logistics officer on duty. The other, she stopped. She had not said this out loud in 3 years. She had written it down once on a piece of paper in a room she was living in, alone in Missoula, at 3 in the morning, and then she had burned it. The other was a voice I recognized as belonging to a senior officer who had no operational business at that base. Name, Forsyth said quietly. At the time, I didn't know his full name. I knew his call sign. I knew his face from a briefing 6 months before. Kira put her hands flat on the table. It took me 4 months after the ambush to match the voice and the face to a name. By then I had been told my service records were under review. I had been told there were questions about my conduct during the incident. I was removed from active duty under what they called administrative review. Who told you that? A colonel I had never met. He came to my billet with 2 JAG officers and told me that there was a formal inquiry into my political decisions during the incident, and that pending the inquiry's outcome I was being placed on indefinite administrative leave. She looked at Forsyth. There was no inquiry. I contacted my own JG representative 6 weeks later and was told there was no record of an administrative action against me. Forsyth said someone used the threat of a false inquiry to pressure you into leaving active duty. Yes, and I was scared enough and confused enough, and I had just watched 2 people die and treated 9 others in a combat zone without a surgeon, and I was not in a state where I was capable of fighting a bureaucratic battle that I didn't understand. Kira paused, so I left, and then I kept leaving, because I didn't know who had sealed the file, and I didn't know what they wanted, and staying in one place felt like making myself a target for something I couldn't see. The name Forsyth said again. The senior officer at the communications tent. Kira looked at her. She had been weighing this for 3 years in the back of her mind, the calculus of saying a name out loud versus the calculus of carrying it until it became irrelevant. The voicemail on her phone had changed that calculation. The men who would be coming, whoever they were, had changed it. General Warren Okafor, she said. The room was very still. Lund and Avery exchanged a look across the table. Forsyth did not look surprised exactly, but something in her expression, locked in the look of a person who has been pursuing a hypothesis for a long time and has just had it confirmed in a way they simultaneously needed and dreaded. He retired 8 months ago, Forsyth said, with full honors. Congressional commendation. He's currently serving on the board of 2 private defense contractors. She picked up her pen. Put it down. He has friends in a great many places. I know, Kira said. When you say you heard him in the communications tent, he was discussing the convoy route. He referenced the threat assessment. He called it acceptable exposure. Those were the words he used. Acceptable exposure. Kira let that sit in the room for a moment. The convoy went out 4 hours later. Forsyth looked at her pen. At the documents on the table. At Kira. Why didn't you come forward earlier, before you disappeared? Because I didn't know who to trust, and because she stopped, looked at the table. Because I was 28 years old, and I had just lost 2 soldiers, and I had been told I was under investigation for something I hadn't done, and I did not have the capacity to also be the person who blew the whistle on a general. She paused. I'm 32 now. And someone called my personal phone today and told me they know where I am. Which means the choice to stay quiet has stopped being available. Forsyth was quiet for a moment. The voicemail. Yes. We'll need the phone, I assumed. Forsyth looked at Avery. A nod passed between them. Then Forsyth turned back to Kira, and when she spoke again, voice canvassed at something that hadn't been in it at the beginning of the conversation, not warmth, but a kind of directness that acknowledged the full weight of what was on the table. Sergeant Mercer. Emily. She leaned forward slightly. What you've just given us is the missing piece of a 14-month investigation. The piece that, without it, we've been building around a hole. This will move fast now, and it is going to be uncomfortable for you. I know. Your identity as Kira Langston is going to become difficult to maintain. People at this hospital will know. I know. You will need protection while this moves through the system. I've protected myself for 3 years. Against people who wanted to erase you quietly, Forsyth said. Now you've given testimony against a retired general with defense contractor connections and friends in the Senate Intelligence Committee. That's a different category of attention. Kira looked at her coffee, which had gone cold. She had not drunk any of it. She thought about the locker room bench and the 4-minute break and the 4-minute break and the ceiling of this hospital that she had been worked within for 3 months as a person whose job was to be invisible and absorb the work nobody else wanted. She thought about Devereaux with his hand raised in a shaking salute, finding her across a crowded room through the sedation and the pain. She thought about 2 soldiers in the dark in a valley in Afghanistan, and the choice that was not a choice because it was already made before she arrived at the question, because that is what triage means. Triage means the decision is built into the math, and you are not the one who decided the math. She had been carrying the weight of a decision that was not hers for 3 years across 6 cities and 4 jobs, and the long, grinding work of becoming someone unremarkable. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. The night was not quiet after that. Forsyth's team moved through the hospital with a low-profile efficiency that was only partially successful. Hargrove General was a working hospital, not a secure facility, and the appearance of military officers and formal activity in a patient corridor was the kind of thing that rippled through a nursing staff within 40 minutes. By 9 p.m., Weston knew more than she should have, and 2 of the residents who had been in the trauma bay that morning had started talking to each other in the break room in the low, speculative tones of people assembling a picture from incomplete pieces. Hale found Kira in the corridor at 9:20 as she was walking toward the exit. "I looked you up," he said. She stopped. "You didn't find anything." "I found Emily Mercer." She turned. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, no tablet, no chart. The full authority of his seniority, stripped back for a moment to just a man standing in a hallway with something to say. He did not look triumphant about what he'd found. He looked unsettled. "You should have said something," he said. "This morning." He stopped. "You wouldn't have listened this morning," she said. "You would have used it against me. Someone with a classified record and a sealed file telling you how to do your job." She paused. That would have been worse. He absorbed this. His jaw worked. The fasciotomy, the decompression. You knew both immediately. Yes. Where does an army medic learn to forward surgical teams in Afghanistan have an OR the size of a storage closet and no time to wait for a surgeon who's handling 3 other cases, she said. You learn what you have to learn. He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong today. Both times I was wrong. Yes. I don't..." He stopped again. Whatever the sentence was going to be, he had not fully assembled it. "I want to understand what I'm dealing with here. Who you actually are." "Right now," Kira said, "I'm a nurse who saved your patient twice. That's all that's changed from this morning. You just know it now." She started walking again. He didn't follow, but he said to her back, "Langston." She stopped without turning around. "I'll tell the administrator the procedures were appropriate," he said. "Both of them. I'll put it in writing." She walked out the door. The parking lot was cold, the October air carrying the particular thin bite of high-altitude autumn. And Kira had been standing near her car for approximately 90 seconds when she became aware that the 2 men parked 3 spots down had not been in the lot when she arrived for her morning shift. They were not Forsyth's people. Forsyth's people were inside. These 2 were outside in a vehicle that was running with the lights off, and when she became aware of them, they became aware of her awareness of them, and the engine noise changed, not louder, just differently configured, the sound of something that had been idle and was now ready. Kira did not run. Running is the wrong response when you don't know the geometry of what you're running into. She took 3 steps back toward the hospital entrance, kept the car between herself and them, pulled her phone, and called the number Forsyth had given her 20 minutes ago. Forsyth picked up on the second ring. "I'm in the parking lot," Kira said. 2 men in a dark vehicle, 3 spaces from my car, engine running, lights off. They were here before I came out. A pause. Are you inside or outside? Outside, near the entrance. Go back in now. Don't run. Kira was already moving. She pushed through the entrance door and into the lobby and turned so she could see through the glass. The vehicle had not moved, but the passenger door had opened and the man getting out was not moving toward the hospital. He was on a phone, reporting that she had gone back inside. She stood in the lobby and held her phone and listened to Forsyth issuing instructions to someone else on another line, and she understood that the quiet life she had spent 3 years constructing the broken locker latch, the hard assignments, the deliberate invisibility had ended this morning when a dying Navy captain raised his hand and said her name. What came next was something she didn't have a name for yet. But whoever was in that parking lot was operating on information they should not have had this quickly, which meant the voicemail was not a threat delivered in advance of action. It was a notification delivered simultaneous with action already in motion. And Forsyth's team had arrived at Hargrove General at the same time as people who wanted something different from her. And the distance between those two things was now the width of a hospital lobby and a glass door and 3 parking spaces. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, different from the voicemail. 4 words, we know what you heard. Forsyth came through the lobby door 40 seconds later with Lund behind her and her hand already on her radio, and the first thing she did was position herself between Kira and the glass entrance, a small, deliberate movement that Kira noted and filed as the action of someone who had done protective work before, not just legal work. The vehicle? Forsyth said. Still there. He went back in after I came inside. Kira held up the phone with the text visible. Forsyth read it without touching the device. How many people know what you heard in that communications tent? Forsyth asked. Before tonight? Nobody. You told no one. In 3 years. I wrote it down once. I burned it. Forsyth looked at Lund. A specific look, the kind that means that this is worse than we thought and doesn't need the words. Lund stepped away and made a call, keeping his back to the lobby, voice low. They're not here because of what you told us tonight, Forsyth said. They can't know that yet. They're here because Devereaux's transfer flagged somewhere, and they've been tracking his movements. He has a compromised security profile. He's been asking questions about the Fort Lanner deployment for 8 months. That kind of persistent inquiry from a senior Navy officer creates a signature, even through unofficial channels. Forsyth glanced at the parking lot. The vehicle had not moved. They followed him here. When your name surfaced, when Devereaux's medical situation put you in the open, they started moving. Kira processed this. They know Valkyrie is at this hospital. They may not have confirmed it's me yet. The text says otherwise. The text says they know what I heard, not who I am. Forsyth looked at her. You're parsing. I'm trying to understand what they actually have versus what they want me to think they have, Kira said. There's a difference between surveillance and bluff. If they knew everything, I'd be in a vehicle right now, not standing in a lobby reading a text message. A beat. Forsyth's expression shifted by a degree, the recalibration again. The adjustment she kept having to make each time Kira said something that didn't fit the picture of a frightened civilian. Fair point. What do you need from me tonight? Kira asked. We're moving Devereaux to a secure facility in the next 2 hours. I need you to... I'm not leaving with a military escort, Kira said. If they're watching the exits, the moment I walk out flanked by your people, we've confirmed everything they're guessing at. I leave the way I came in. My car, my route. You put someone on the road if you want, but not visible. Forsyth studied her for a moment. You've done this before. I've thought about doing this before, every time I moved cities. Kira looked at the parking lot once more and then deliberately looked away from it toward the elevator bank, toward the familiar geography of the hospital she had spent 91 days learning. Give me 20 minutes to get clear. Then move Devereaux. They'll have to choose which to follow. You're offering yourself as a diversion. I'm offering myself as the more interesting target, Kira said. Devereaux is a patient. I'm the witness. She met Forsyth's eyes. Get him out safe. That's the priority. Forsyth held her gaze for a long moment. Then she gave Lund a look, and Lund nodded and took out his phone again. Avery will be in a gray sedan at the South at Service exit in 15 minutes, Forsyth said. Not escorting. Following, clean distance. If you're picked up, he can respond. I won't be picked up, Emily. Forsyth said the name the way someone says a name when they want it to function as an anchor. Don't get comfortable being right about everything. She went back through the hospital the long way, through the East Wing she had worked for 3 months, past the nurses' station where the overnight shift had started, and no one looked up because she was still in their peripheral awareness. Just the recovery nurse who came in early and left late and didn't require attention. The broken latch locker room. The chart station where she had spent hours documenting other people's recoveries. The corridor that smelled like antiseptic and industrial carpet, and the specific institutional exhaustion of a building that never fully slept. She took the stairwell to the ground floor and exited through a side door that opened onto a loading area adjacent to the south parking structure, which was a different structure from the main lot where the dark vehicle was sitting. She had noted this exit on her second week, not because she had anticipated needing it exactly, but because she noted exits, the way she noted water stains and supply locations, and the particular rhythms of which doctors arrived late and which nurses cut corners on documentation. It was the same impulse. Everything was information. Information was always worth having. Avery's gray sedan was at the service exit when she came around the corner. She didn't stop. She walked past it at a normal pace, glanced at the driver's side window, and kept walking to her own car in Lot B, Section 3, which she had parked that morning in a spot with clear sight lines to 2 exits. Because she had been doing that for 3 years, and old habits moved faster than conscious thought. She drove north, no tail that she could see. Avery's sedan 2 blocks back, maintaining distance. She ran 3 right turns in a row the box, and he matched it at distance without closing, which told her he was competent. She drove to her apartment, which was a second-floor unit in a building that had 4 entrances and a fire escape that reached the alley. She had chosen it for these features. She had chosen everything for its features over the past 3 years, and the accumulation of those choices was a life that was functional and joyless and safe in the way that bunkers are safe protected against attack at the cost of being uninhabitable as a permanent residence. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights and held her phone and thought about what had been set in motion. Forsyth's investigation was real. The evidence they had assembled was substantial. But evidence without a witness who could testify to the moment of decision to a general's voice saying acceptable exposure 4 hours before 7 soldiers died was a case built around a hole. She had been the hole. She had been invisible for 3 years, and the hole had stayed open, and people like General Warren Okafor had walked around it freely, building careers and board positions and commendations, while 7 soldiers stayed buried and 2 contractors buried the paper trail, and Devereaux spent 8 months asking questions that kept getting quietly closed. She had burned the piece of paper. She should have kept it. She had run instead of staying. She should have stayed. She knew, with the particular honesty that came only in dark rooms without witnesses, that she had made the choices she made because she had been young and exhausted and frightened, and because the bureaucratic machinery of the military had been deployed against her with a precision that was designed to overwhelm exactly that state. She was not absolved by this. She was also not destroyed by it. She was somewhere in the complicated middle, which was where most people lived when they were being truthful about the weight of what they had or hadn't done. Her phone rang. Forsyth. Devereaux is clear, Forsyth said. We moved him. The vehicle in the parking lot followed the wrong exit. Lund staged a decoy. They'll figure it out. But we have a window. Good. There's a development. Forsyth paused in a way that contained information before the sentence did. Avery ran the plate on the parking lot vehicle while you were leaving. It came back to a security consulting firm registered in Northern Virginia. Meridian Group, LLC. Kira waited. Meridian Group has Department of Defense contracts. Current, active contracts. Their primary client in the last fiscal year was a Defense Procurement Oversight Committee. Another pause. That committee is chaired by a retired general who serves as its senior advisor. Okafor, Kira said. Yes, she sat with that. The shape of it. Not surprising, not after the voicemail, not after the text, not after 3 years of understanding that the person who had sealed her file had resources and wasn't finished. But the confirmation of it had a specific weight, heavier than the theory. They're not surveillance, she said. If Meridian is moving people to Spokane this fast, they're not gathering information. They already have it. I agree. They came to stop me from talking to you. Too late for that, Forsyth said. But yes. Kira stood up and went to the window and looked at the alley. Nothing visible. That meant nothing. Good surveillance wasn't visible. What happens now? We move to a formal secure briefing. I want your testimony on record, properly documented, within 24 hours. After that, the investigation goes to a tier where Okafor's connections can't reach it federal, not military oversight. And in the meantime, I'd like you to not be in that apartment, Forsyth said. Avery is outside. He can bring you to a staging location. I need an hour. Emily, 1 hour, Kira said. There's something I need to do first. She ended the call before Forsyth could argue, which was not the most cooperative thing she had done that day, but was far from the least. She went to the closet and moved 3 boxes stacked in the back left corner boxes that had been packed and repacked so many times their corners had gone soft, and from behind them she retrieved a waterproof case the size of a laptop bag, gray, with a combination lock she opened from muscle memory. Inside, a hard drive, a separate USB. A folder of physical documents, pages she had collected and photographed over 8 months before her discharge. Pieces of the administrative record she had requested through official channels. Before those channels were closed to her, communications she had printed in the office of her JAG representative during the one appointment they had given her before the access stopped. She had not burned these. She had carried them through 6 cities and packed them behind boxes and never looked at them because looking at them meant admitting that she had known all along that the quiet life was temporary. She put the case in her bag and called Avery. I'm ready, she said. The secure location was a field office, a nondescript building in a commercial district south of downtown that looked like a regional insurance company from the outside and had reinforced interior walls and a server room that Avery showed her with. The quiet pride of someone who had been involved in setting it up. Forsyth was there. Lund. 2 people she hadn't met, a man and a woman who introduced themselves with last names only, and the careful Nutra federal investigators who were practiced at not revealing which agency they were from until it mattered. Kira set the waterproof case on the conference table. Forsyth looked at it. What is that? Documentation, Kira said. Partial. I was only able to pull records for about 8 months before I lost access. But the communications from that period include 3 references to the Korengal Valley route assessment and 2 personnel transfers that I flagged at the time, but didn't understand until later. She opened the case. She laid out the documents. And then, over the next 3 hours, she did what she had spent 3 years not doing. She went through it. All of it. The route assessment flagged as compromised. The communication chain that stopped 2 levels below Okafor, conspicuously, the way chains stop when someone has been careful. The personnel transfers that moved 2 intelligence officers out of the forward operating base in the 72 hours before the convoy, removing the people who would have been responsible for confirming the threat assessment before authorization. The federal investigators took notes. Real notes, pen on paper, None of it verbal, the discipline of people who understood that digital records in this kind of investigation were a liability until they were properly secured. Forsyth sat across from Kira and watched her go through the documents with an that had moved past recalibration into something Kira didn't have an easy name for. Respect, maybe. Or the specific weight of watching someone dismantle 3 years of self-imposed silence in the span of a night. At 1 a.m., one of the federal investigators, the woman whose name Kira had learned, was Reyes, said the hard drive. Encrypted, Kira said. I'll give you the key verbally. You don't write it down in this room. Reyes looked at her steadily. We can compel access through a warrant. You could, but I'm giving it to you voluntarily, which means I'm a cooperating witness rather than a subject, which means the chain of custody for everything on that drive is clean and Okafor's lawyers can't touch it. She held Reyes's gaze. I've had 3 years to think about what would happen when this conversation finally occurred. I'm not improvising. Reyes looked at Forsyth. Forsyth looked at Kira. Something passed between all three of them, not warmth, but the recognition that the person sitting across the table had thought about this more carefully and for longer than anyone in the room had anticipated. The key, Reyes said. Kira gave it to her. She slept for 4 hours on a cot in the back room of the field office, and she slept without dreams, which she had learned over 3 years to take as its own kind of information, her nervous system's assessment of the situation. The first night in a long time that the accumulated tension of existing as a person under quiet threat had released slightly from the shoulders and the jaw. She was awake at 6. Coffee bad, from a machine in the hallway. The kind of bitter institutional coffee that tasted like exactly where you were. Forsyth was at the conference table when Kira came back in, and the documents had been organized into a different configuration, more precise. The physical record now paralleling something on the laptop screen that Forsyth kept adjusted away from the room camera. Lund was on a phone call in the corner. Reyes and her partner were gone. Reyes's team pulled something overnight, Forsyth said, without preamble. She turned the laptop so Kira could see the screen. It was a communication record, emails, internal, from a server that had been accessed through legal process. Kira didn't have the details of. The dates were from the week before the ambush. The names in the header were redacted in the copy she was looking at, but the content, the language, the operational terminology, the specific references to the route, and the timeline was not redacted. It read like a plan, not like an oversight, not like a miscalculation in threat assessment or a bureaucratic failure to communicate flagged intelligence up the chain. It read like a considered, multi-step decision to send a convoy down a compromised route with full awareness of the risk, for a reason that the communication did not state explicitly, but that was visible in the shape of what was not said. The absence of the standard risk mitigation requests, the absence of the intelligence confirmation protocol, the absence of the paper that should have been generated if anyone was following procedure. They knew, Kira said. The analysis suggests yes. Forsyth's voice was even, but there was a tension in her posture that had not been there last night. There is a theory in the investigation, one that Reyes's team has been building for 6 months about why the convoy was sent. The route carried not just personnel, but a specific cargo shipment that was listed in the manifest as medical supplies. Kira looked up. It wasn't medical supplies, Forsyth said. The manifest was a cover for a shipment of decommissioned weapons components being moved outside the standards disposal chain. The value of those components on the private market. She stopped, selected a different word. Significant. The kind of significant that creates motive. Kira sat down. The coffee cup in her hand had gone warm and then started to cool, and she hadn't noticed. Someone wanted the convoy hit. Someone wanted the cargo recovered in the chaos following an ambush. In a genuine combat emergency, the medical personnel and soldiers would be the priority. The manifest cargo would be secondary. Forsyth met her eyes. The convoy was hit. The medical personnel and soldiers became the priority. The manifest cargo disappeared. 7 soldiers dead. 2 contractors' weapons components gone. General Warren Okafor, currently a board member of 2 private defense contractors, with 8 months of sustained inquiry from Captain Devereaux being quietly suppressed through channels. Kira put the coffee cup down carefully. The ambush was staged. "We can't prove it yet," Forsyth said. "We can prove the route was known to be compromised. We can prove the intelligence officers were moved out of position before the convoy departed. We can prove the manifest was falsified. What we cannot yet prove is the direct connection between those decisions and Okafor's financial interest in the cargo. My testimony puts him at the base that morning." Yes. His voice on the communications recording, if one exists. The communications were routed through a system that purges automatically every 30 days, Forsyth said. Standard protocol. Gone. Witnesses. The logistics officer on duty that morning was Corporal David Ferris. Forsyth's expression did something careful. He died in a single vehicle accident 14 months ago, outside Raleigh, North Carolina. The room was very quiet. 14 months ago, Kira said. That's when you opened the active investigation. Yes. Kira looked at the laptop screen, at the emails that read like a plan, at the shape of something large and deliberate that had been built over years and was now beginning to be visible in its actual dimensions. I'm the last clean witness. To his presence at that base, yes. Forsyth leaned forward. Which is why Meridian's people were in that parking lot last night. They didn't come to surveil. They came to evaluate options. She said the last 2 words with the precise care of someone who has chosen them to avoid saying something more direct. Kira understood what evaluating options meant when applied to the last witness. You need to move this faster, she said. We're moving. Faster than you're moving. If Okafor knows JAG has an active team here, and if Meridian is already on the ground, the window, before he does something significant, is not a comfortable window. She looked at Forsyth. What would it take to escalate this to a level he can't reach? A formal federal referral. Congressional oversight. Forsyth paused. Those take time to arrange. Do you have a contact in congressional oversight who's been read in on this investigation? A beat. There's a senator whose office has been following the investigation through a staff liaison. Informally. That needs to become formal today. Emily, the documentation process alone. If Okafor moves before you can formalize the referral, the documentation doesn't matter, Kira said. You need the political cover before you need the perfect paperwork. Get the senator's office on the record. Today. Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. There was something in it that might have been frustration. The frustration of a lawyer being told by a former combat medic how to run a legal strategy. There was also under that the look of someone who knew the point was correct. I'll make a call, Forsyth said. The call happened. Kira was not in the room for it, but she heard the tone of Forsyth's voice through the wall, controlled, deliberate, the cadence of someone presenting a case in compressed form to someone who needed it compressed. 40 minutes later, Forsyth came back into the conference room and said, Senator Diane Nakamura's office. Her senior defense policy advisor will be here at noon. Good, Kira said. You understand this becomes public at some point, Forsyth said. The testimony, the witness identity. Kira Langston stops being viable. Kira Langston was always temporary, Kira said. That was the point. What she didn't say was the rest of it, that she had known for 3 years that Kira Langston would eventually stop being sufficient. That the whole architecture of the alternate identity was a bridge, not a destination. That you cannot be invisible indefinitely when the thing you're hiding from is not a mistake, but a truth. And truths have mass, and mass eventually pulls things toward resolution, whether you intend them to get there or not. At 10 a.m., Lund came in with a phone. Devereaux wants to talk to you, he said, and his expression was careful enough that Kira took the phone without argument. Devereaux's voice was rough from the chest tube and the second round of medication, but It was clear. He was lucid. They told me what Forsyth found last night. The ambush. Yes. You've known there was something wrong with the mission for 3 years. I knew something, she said. I didn't know the full shape of it. A long exhale on his end. Warwick and Tremblay. Yes. They died in something that was constructed, he said. And the word constructed landed in the sentence with a specific weight, not theatrical, just precise. The weight of a man confronting the difference between a soldier dying in war and a soldier being used in a transaction. Yes, Kira said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to testify. Whatever JAG needs, they'll need the chain of your inquiry. Every time you asked about the Fort Lanner deployment and was shut down. Who told you to stop when? I have records, he said. I kept records because I had a feeling someone might want me not to have them. A pause. I know something about carrying things carefully. She didn't answer that. Valkyrie, he said. Don't. I'm saying it because it's accurate, he said. Not as a compliment. Just, you carried this alone for 3 years, and you're still standing, and you didn't fold when Forsyth walked into that room. I just stopped. It matters. That's all I'm saying. She handed the phone back to Lund. Senator Nakamura's policy advisor arrived at noon. His name was Patterson, and he was 35 and efficient, and had the specific quality of someone who had spent years in rooms where large decisions were being made, and had learned to move fast and say little until the moment when saying something mattered. He listened to the summary. He read the key documents. He looked at the email communications on the laptop for a long time. What do you need from the senator's office? He asked Forsyth. Formal investigative oversight referral. On record. Today, Patterson looked at Kira. He had been looking at her intermittently throughout the briefing, the particular attention of someone mapping a person against the account of them. You're the witness. Yes. You'd be willing to testify to a congressional subcommittee. Yes. With your identity fully disclosed. Emily Mercer, former Army Ranger, combat medic. She had not said yes to this yet in those exact words. She said it now. Yes. Patterson closed his folder. The senator has been looking for the missing piece of this investigation for 6 months. He looked at Forsyth. I'll have the formal referral drafted by 4 o'clock. And that was the moment when the thing that had been moving underground for 3 years broke the surface. Not with drama. With a man in a suit closing a folder and picking up his phone to call his office. Kira sat in the chair and let the weight of it settle. She had done the thing. She had said the name. She had opened the case and given the key, and agreed to stand in front of a congressional subcommittee and be Emily Mercer in front of cameras and records, and the people who had spent years benefiting from her absence. She had also not slept more than 4 hours, and had eaten nothing since the coffee that tasted like a field office, and she was running on the specific fuel of someone who has been in sustained high-pressure operation long enough that the body stops registering ordinary needs and runs on something else entirely. She knew this state. She knew it would end, and she'd need to manage the landing. But not yet. Forsyth's phone rang at 2:47 p.m. Forsyth looked at the screen and answered it and listened, and what happened to her face over the next 30 seconds was not panic. Forsyth was not a person who panicked, but it was the controlled version of alarm. The tightening at the jaw that meant the call contained information that changed the geometry of the situation. She ended the call and looked at Kira. Meridian Group's 2 operatives were picked up an hour ago by Spokane PD on an unrelated traffic stop, she said. They had documentation in the vehicle, identity papers, surveillance records. A pause. They also had a second set of orders. The orders weren't for observation. Kira waited. The orders named you, Forsyth said, and they named Devereaux. And they came from an authorization code that Reyes's team has just traced to a communications system registered to Meridian Group's primary client. She put her phone on the table. Okafor knows the investigation is active. He knows you've been found. And he authorized a response before we could get the senator's referral on record. How long ago were these orders issued? Kira asked. Timestamp shows 11 p.m. last night, about 2 hours after the parking lot. Kira calculated. The orders were already in motion before I gave Forsyth's team anything. Before tonight's referral. Yes. Which means he was moving before he knew exactly what I'd said. He was moving because you existed, Forsyth said. The testimony he can't contain, he prevents from existing. That's the logic. She looked at Kira with the directness that had been building all day. The operatives we have are low level. They had orders, not context. It won't be the last attempt. Kira nodded slowly. Outside the field office, the commercial district was doing its afternoon business, people moving past the windows with ordinary purposefulness, the city entirely uninvested. In the fact that in this room, the architecture of something that had been built to stay hidden was under enough structural pressure that the walls were starting to show. I need to go back to the hospital, she said. Forsyth stared at her. Absolutely not. Not as a target, Kira said, as the person who designed the trap. She looked at Forsyth steadily. Okafor's operatives came to Spokane because that's where I was last confirmed. If we move me now, they lose the scent, and Okafor recalculates. He goes dark. He lawyers up. He has enough connections to delay the investigation for months while he protects himself. She let that sit. But if I stay visible, if he thinks he still has a window, he'll keep moving. And moving means exposure. Forsyth was shaking her head. You need him to act before the referral is formalized, Kira said. Because the moment Nakamura's office puts the oversight on record, he pulls back and uses his political cover to slow everything down. You want him to overreach while you're still operating in the space where you can catch him doing it. You're describing using yourself as bait. I'm describing the only play that ends this before he can contain it, Kira said. I go back visible. You put people around the perimeter, not in the building. He sends in another team. You take the team with the orders in their pocket, and this time the orders lead back to him with direct authorization evidence, not just a communications code. The room was very quiet for a long moment. Lund said, to Forsyth, she's not wrong about the containment risk. Forsyth looked at Kira for a long time. The look of someone weighing a decision that has no good version, only a best available one. If we do this, Forsyth said slowly, you are not acting independently. You coordinate every move. You have a direct line to Lund at all times. The moment any contact is made, you do not engage, you extract, and let us work. Agreed. And you tell me right now that you understand the difference between being tactically useful and being reckless, Forsyth said. Because those two things look similar from the inside and very different from the outside. Kira met her eyes. I've been making that distinction since I was 28 years old in a valley in Afghanistan with 11 people bleeding and a kit that could only stretch so far. She held the gaze. I know exactly what I'm walking back into. Forsyth picked up her phone. The plan took 45 minutes to construct and another hour to position. Avery went back to the hospital in advance. Lund coordinated with 2 additional officers who were brought in from the regional field office and positioned in the parking structure and the east wing access corridor, plainclothes, radios on a secure channel. Patterson's accelerated the senatorial referral timeline, working his phone from the conference table with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that the political cover needed to exist before the operational piece concluded, not after. Kira changed back into her scrubs. She had a set in her bag. She always had a set in her bag. Old habit. The same way she always had the exit locations mapped and the case packed and the combination held in her fingers, and she put them on in the field office bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She had spent 3 years making herself unnoticeable. The scrubs were part of that. The tight hair, the minimal footprint, the east wing recovery section, where the work was hard and the visibility was low. She had built an architecture of insignificance and lived inside it because it was the only structure she could maintain without it eventually collapsing under the weight of what she actually was. She walked out of the bathroom and back into the conference room and picked up Lund's direct line number and put her phone in her pocket. "Ready?" Forsyth asked. "Yes," Kira said. She drove back to Hargrove General and pulled into Lot B, Section 3, the same spot she always used, and walked through the main entrance and badged through the East Wing corridor and arrived at the nurses' station, where Weston was at the desk, with the expression of someone who has been managing an unusual situation and is glad to have a familiar element return to it. "You're back," Weston said. "Not a question. I'm back," Kira said. She picked up a chart. She went to work. She did it the way she always did at present, without demanding to be noticed, efficient, reliable, the nurse in East Wing recovery who absorbed the hard assignments and said nothing that wasn't necessary. Except south there were 2 plainclothes officers in the parking structure and 1 in the corridor near the stairwell, and Patterson was drafting the senatorial referral, and Forsyth was 40 minutes away with a team that could move fast, and the waterproof case with the hard drive was in federal custody, and Captain Devereaux was in a secure location with his own testimony documented and ready. The trap was set. Kira was the visible part of it. She understood this and had chosen it with open eyes. At 6:22 p.m., Weston came to find her in room 14, where she was checking a post-surgical patient's drain. "There's a man at the nurse's station," Weston said quietly. "He says he's from hospital administration. He wants to speak with you specifically." She paused. "I don't recognize him, and his badge doesn't match our administration's standard format." Kira kept her hands on the drain check, finished the measurement, noted it. "What does he look like?" she asked. Weston described him. Kira held the description against what she knew about Meridian Group's operational profile, about the parking lot, about the orders with the authorization code. She reached in her pocket and keyed the radio function on the direct line to Lund. "Tell him I'll be out in a moment," she said to Weston. She looked up from the drain check, and through the room's window, she could see the nurse's station and the man standing there, and he looked entirely like someone from hospital administration. And he was looking directly at her through the glass, with the particular stillness of someone who has found what they came for and is deciding what to do about it. And behind him, entering through the East Wing door that Kira had used every morning for 91 days, was a second man, and a third, and none of them were hospital staff, and all of them were moving with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of people who did not expect to encounter meaningful resistance. Kira pressed the key on Lund's direct line and said 2 words, "They're here." She said it quietly, without urgency in her voice, the say you see something that has been expected and has now arrived. Then she put the phone in her scrubs pocket and turned to Weston, who was standing in the doorway, with the expression of someone who has just understood that the unusual situation she had been managing is considerably more unusual than she thought. "Maddox." "Go to the break room," Kira said. "Stay there until someone from hospital security comes to get you. Don't use the corridor. What's happening? Go now, Deborah." Weston went. It was the first time Kira had used her first name, and something in the directness of it communicated what the words alone didn't need to. Weston moved fast down the back hallway away from the nurse's station, and Kira watched her clear the corner before she looked back through the room at the 3 rooms window at the 3 men in the corridor. The one at the nurse's station had stopped pretending to wait. He had seen her CC him. The calculation was done the window for the approach as administration. Official had closed the moment she keyed the radio, and he knew it, and now the situation was what it actually was, rather than what it had been dressed as. The 2 behind him had spread to either side of the corridor, not running, moving with the deliberate spacing of people who had done room clearance before, and understood corridor geometry. Kira stepped back from the window and into the room, putting the post-surgical patient and the door between herself and the corridor. The patient, a 63-year-old man, recovering from a bowel resection, was awake and watching her with wide eyes. She spoke to him with the tone she used for high-alert situations. Calm, precise, no information beyond what he needed. "Mr. Dietrich, I need you to press your call button and keep pressing it. And I need you to stay in the bed. Can you do that?" He pressed it. "Good." She moved to the far side of the room, near the window, and assessed. Second floor. The window opened onto a maintenance overhang, and then the parking structure. Lund's people were in the parking structure. She was not going through the window. That was a last option. Not a first one, but she mapped it anyway, because that was what you did. The door opened. The first man came through it with the administrative badge still on his jacket, and the posture of someone who had stopped performing and was now just present. He was mid-40s, compact, the kind of build that suggested controlled fitness rather than size. His hands were visible, nothing in them, which told her the approach was still in the evaluation phase. "Emily Mercer," he said. "Not a question." "Wrong room," she said. "You're looking for administration. That's the other building." He looked at her without expression. "We need you to come with us." "I'm in the middle of patient care. That's going to have to wait." "No," she said, "it really isn't." She held his gaze. "The man in that bed has a surgical drain that needs monitoring. If I leave this room in the next 10 minutes without completing this assessment, his post-surgical complication risk goes up significantly. That's not a negotiating point. That's just medicine." She kept her voice even, the way she kept her voice even when she was doing something that required steadiness to execute. "You came for a witness. A witness who is arrested in a hospital room while abandoning a patient is a sympathetic figure in front of a congressional subcommittee. That's also not a negotiating point." Something moved in the man's face, not hesitation exactly, but the brief recalibration of someone who had been told the approach would be simple and is encountering friction. From the corridor, muffled by the door, a short, sharp exchange of voices. Then running, then a sound that was not a gunshot, but was adjacent a taser discharge. The grunt of someone going down hard on linoleum. The man in the room turned toward the sound involuntarily. In 1 second. That was what it was, 1 second of divided attention. The automatic response of a person whose situational awareness has been pulled in 2 directions at once. Kira crossed the room in that second and put herself against the wall beside the door. And when he turned back, the geometry had changed. She was no longer across the room from him. She was beside him, and the door was within her reach, and the angle made his next move complicated in ways that a room clearance professional would recognize and have to reassess. "You're going to have a bad day," she said, "but it doesn't have to be a worse one." The door came open from the outside, Lund's face. Behind him, Avery, and behind Avery, 2 officers in the plain clothes she had last seen them wearing in the parking structure. The man from Meridian looked at the room, at Lund, at Kira against the wall, at the patient in the bed with the call button in his fist and the wide eyes. He made the calculation that the situation required him to make. He put his hands up. It took 11 minutes to clear the east wing. 2 of the 3 Meridian operatives were taken in the corridor. Lund's team had come up through the stairwell when Kira keyed the radio, fast and coordinated, arriving from a direction the operatives hadn't accounted for. The third, the one in room 14, was placed in restraints in the hallway while Kira went back to check Mr. Dietrich's drain, which she did with full concentration, and then documented accurately because the work did not stop being the work, because the situation around it had been dramatic. Garrett appeared at the doorway while she was documenting. He looked at the man in restraints in the hallway, at the officers moving through the corridor, at Kira calmly writing in a patient chart. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine." She didn't look up. "Can you check the drain output on room 12? I was supposed to do it 20 minutes ago." He stared at her for another moment. Then he went to check room 12. Forsyth arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later, having been in transit when Lund called. She came through the east wing with the contained energy of someone managing several simultaneous priorities. and she found Kira at the nurse's station, finishing her documentation on 3 patients whose routine care had been deferred during the previous hour. All 3 are in custody, Forsyth said, coming alongside the station. The orders they were carrying match the authorization code from last night, Kira said, not looking up. Yes, and they go further. Forsyth's voice dropped slightly, not for secrecy, the corridor was clear, but from the weight of what she was saying. The orders reference a communication chain that leads directly to a Meridian Group executive with documented access to Okafor's private communications system. Reyes's team has been working through the night, and they have the link. She paused. It's direct, Emily. Not inferential, direct. Kira put her pen down. She looked at the wall of the nurse's station, at the assignment board, at the names of patients in their rooms, at the mundane grid of a night shift in a hospital corridor. She thought about how this wall had looked to her for 91 mornings, and what it was going to look like tomorrow, and whether she would still be behind this desk or somewhere else entirely. What happens now, she said. Reyes files the formal criminal referral tonight. The senatorial office has already been briefed. Patterson confirmed 30 minutes ago that the senator is prepared to go on record with the oversight designation tomorrow morning. Forsyth moved closer. With the operatives in custody and the orders documented and the communications chain intact, Okafor's legal position has collapsed. His attorneys will know it by morning. The question is whether he lawyers up and goes quiet, or whether he runs, Kira said. Yes, he won't run, Kira said. Men like Okafor don't run. They have too much invested in the identity, the commendations, the board positions, the congressional relationships. Running means admitting the whole edifice is built on something that can't hold weight. He'll fight it. He'll find a way to frame this as a political attack, a disgruntled former soldier, a mishandled investigation by a judgy team with an agenda. Forsyth looked at her. You've thought about this. For 3 years, he'll have legal representation that will attempt to discredit your testimony. Your record, your identity change, the fact that you disappeared from military service, all of it will be characterized as evidence of instability rather than self-preservation. I know. Are you ready for that? Kira looked at the assignment board. At the name Langston penciled into the East Wing recovery section in Weston's handwriting, the way it had been penciled in every morning for 3 months. Tell me when and where to be. The formal process moved faster than she had expected and slower than she needed it to, which was the nature of formal processes. Reyes filed the criminal referral at 11 p.m. Patterson's call to the senator's office resulted in a briefing that ran until 2 in the morning in a congressional liaison's office in Washington, which Forsyth attended by video link from the field office. Kavra was not in those rooms. She was back in the field office on the cot, sleeping the 4 hours her body would accept, before it woke her up and insisted she be useful again. By morning, 3 things had happened. The first was that Senator Nakamura's office issued a formal statement announcing a congressional oversight investigation into the Fort Lanner deployment and the subsequent handling of classified military records. The statement named no individuals, but specified the scope in terms that anyone reading it with knowledge of the underlying facts would understand completely. The second was that Warren Okafor's attorneys filed a preemptive motion in federal court challenging the authority of the investigative body and requesting an emergency injunction on the release of any communications records associated with their client. The motion was denied within 4 hours by a federal judge who had been briefed by Reyes's team the previous evening. The third was that the Spokane Register ran a story on its front page about the arrest of 3 men at Hargrove General Hospital, identified as private security contractors in connection with an ongoing federal investigation. The story named Meridian Group. It did not yet name Okafor, but it named the firm and its primary federal client, and anyone who could read a defense contractor database could make connection in under 10 minutes. Kyra read the story on her phone in the field office at 6 a.m. drinking the bad coffee, and experienced a feeling she couldn't immediately name. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too clean for what this was. It was more like the specific sensation of a pressure that has been building in a closed space, finally finding a vent. Not release. Just movement. The thing that had been static beginning to move. Forsyth came in at 7 with actual coffee from a place 2 blocks away, which Ketra accepted without comment, and which tasted like something a person would voluntarily drink. "He's going to testify," Forsyth said, sitting across from her. Okafor. "His attorneys called this morning. They want to negotiate terms. They want immunity. They're asking for it. They won't get it." Forsyth's expression was flat. What they'll get is a chance to put his version of events on record before ours is the only one that exists. His attorneys know the communications chain is documented. They know the operative orders are in custody. They're trying to control the narrative going into the formal hearings. What's his version? Forsyth wrapped her hands around her cup. "We don't have the full picture yet, but the preliminary framing from the attorney is the convoy decision was a classified operational judgment call. The route assessment was weighed against mission priorities that cannot be disclosed. Okafor had no knowledge of the cargo manifest discrepancy. The sealing of the file was a standard security measure." She paused. "And Sergeant Mercer's disappearance from active duty was my own choice," Kira said. "A voluntary separation under standard administrative procedures with no irregularities." Kira looked at her coffee. He built himself a version where everything has a bureaucratic explanation. He's had 3 years to build it. So have I. She set the cup down. The difference is, mine has a witness who was standing outside a communications tent in Afghanistan and heard a general discuss an acceptable level of soldier deaths in terms that don't exist in any legitimate operational framework. She looked at Forsyth. "And mine has the documents I've been carrying in a waterproof case through 6 cities. Forsyth looked at her for a moment. "The hard drive. Reyes's team has been working through it, and there's a communication on there that you may not have fully understood when you copied it." Forsyth opened her laptop and turned it. On the screen was a document, a scanned communication, the kind that had been printed from a digital system and then photographed, the resolution slightly degraded, but the content readable. "This is from the week before the ambush. It's addressed through internal channels to the logistics officer at the forward operating base." The routing code on the header, she pointed. "This routing code belongs to a system that was used exclusively by senior command staff during that operational period." Kira looked at the routing code. She had copied this document 8 months after the ambush, during the 1 week she'd had access to the JGA representative's office. She had photographed it because it referenced the convoy and the date. She had not known, at the time, how to read a routing code. "Okafor sent this," she said. "The routing code traces to his command access identifier," Forsyth said. "Not a subordinate acting on his behalf. His personal access code used to route a communication to the logistics officer 4 days before the convoy." She paused. "The communication instructs the officer to proceed with the convoy on the planned schedule regardless of updated route assessments." Kira read it again, regardless of updated route assessments. Not a judgment call weighed against mission priorities. Not a classified operational decision made by a general with incomplete information. An explicit instruction to ignore the intelligence that said the route was compromised. He knew, Kira said, and it was not the first time she had said this. But this time it was different. This time it was in a document with a routing code, and a date, and a chain of custody that placed it in her possession within months of the event and in federal custody within 24 hours. "Yes," Forsyth said. Kira sat back. She thought about standing in the dark outside a communications tent, 28 years old Witchshot. Hearing a voice, she recognized saying two words, acceptable exposure, and not fully understanding the architecture of what those words meant. She had understood the surface. She had not understood the depth. She understood it now, 3 years later, in a field office with bad cot springs and good coffee from 2 blocks away, and the understanding settled into her the way cold water settles into stone slowly, completely, filling every space. 7 soldiers. Not acceptable exposure. Not a judgment call. A deliberate suppression of intelligence for the purpose of protecting a cargo shipment of decommissioned weapons components whose disappearance in the chaos of an ambush would benefit specific financial interests. She had spent 3 years blaming herself for the 2 she couldn't save. She put that down now. Not easily. Not cleanly. It was not the kind of thing you put down the way you set a cup on a table. It was the kind of thing you put down the way you put down something heavy after carrying it a long time with muscle memory that is still braced for the weight, even after the weight is gone, with the specific exhausted relief of a person whose body has been compensating for too long and is going to feel the correction for a while. "What do you need from me today?" she asked. Formal deposition. On record, on camera, before the formal hearing. Forsyth closed the laptop. "We have a space set up. It'll take most of the day. By end of business, your testimony is in the federal record, and Okafor's legal team can no longer claim there's no witness." "Then let's go," Kira said. The deposition room was not dramatic. Gray walls, a long table, a camera on a tripod, a federal stenographer who introduced herself by name and then became furniture for the next 6 hours. Forsyth conducted. Reyes was present. 2 additional attorneys from the investigative office sat at the far end of the table with their own notes. Kira told it from the beginning, not from the lobby of Hargrove General, and the moment Devereaux's arm turned black, that was the end of the beginning, not the beginning itself. She went back further. She went back to the forward operating base, to the medical supply inventory, to the canvas wall of the communications tent, and the 2 voices and the specific phrase she had carried in her memory through 6 cities and 4 jobs and 91 days of invisible work in East Wing recovery. She told it accurately. She did not perform it. She did not soften it or sharpen it or arrange it for effect. She described the ambush the way she remembered it, not heroically, not as a meditation on sacrifice, but as an event experienced from inside it, which meant chaos and noise and the specific decision calculus of triage under fire, which meant moving to the next patient while someone behind you was still making sounds, which meant doing the work that was possible and accepting in the moment that the work that was impossible was also not yours to carry. She described 2 soldiers whose injuries were not survivable, with field equipment and no surgeon. She described the 9 who were. She described Devereaux with a chest wound and a compromised lung in the dark, and what it took to keep him breathing until the medevac arrived, and what she had said to him, which she remembered because she had repeated it to herself so many times in the years after that, it had become a kind of script, the words she used to remind herself that she had done the possible. The federal stenographer typed steadily and made no sound. At 4 p.m., Reyes asked the question Kira had been waiting for, the one that brought the whole deposition to its structural center. At any point, during or after the Fort Lanner deployment, were you given reason to believe the convoy route decision had been made in contravention of existing intelligence assessments? Yes, Kira said. I heard a senior officer instruct the logistics officer to proceed with the route regardless of updated assessments, 4 days before the convoy departed. And the officer you heard giving that instruction, can you identify him? General Warren Okafor? Kira said. I identified his voice from a briefing 6 months prior. Picont? It's professionally. I confirmed his identity with certainty 4 months after the ambush, when I was able to match the voice and the physical description to his publicly available command record. The stenographer typed, the camera recorded. The gray room held the statement, the way rooms hold things without weight or commentary, simply present. The deposition concluded at 6 p.m. Forsyth walked Kira out of the building, and they stood on the sidewalk in the October air, which was the same thin cold it had been the night before. the seasons not having adjusted for the scale of what had happened in the intervening 20 hours. Okafor's attorneys withdrew the immunity request 2 hours ago, Forsyth said. Kira looked at the street. They saw which way it was going. They saw the communications chain, the operative orders, the routing code, and the deposition notification. They withdrew the request and asked for a meeting with the federal prosecutor's office to discuss cooperation. A pause. Cooperation, in this context, means he's going to give up someone above him or beside him in exchange for reduced exposure. Is there someone above him? Possibly. Reyes's team thinks the weapons component diversion wasn't a solo operation. The scale of it, the logistics, the contractor relationships, the subsequent cover-up suggests a network. Forsyth looked at the street. If he cooperates, it gets bigger before it gets smaller. Kira absorbed this. The soldiers' families. They'll be notified through official channels once the formal investigation is announced publicly, which will be. Forsyth checked her phone. Senator Nakamura is holding a press conference tomorrow morning. The families find out from a press conference? Forsyth's expression held the specific tension of someone who is navigating the gap between how things should happen and how they functionally occur within institutional processes. The notification protocol will run concurrently with the announcement. They won't find out from news coverage. Is there a mechanism for me to? Kira stopped. This was not a question she had planned to ask. It surfaced on its own from a place she hadn't fully examined, the place that had been holding the names of Corporal Dennis Warwick and Private First Class Alyssa Tremblay for 3 years. I'd like to speak to them before it becomes news, if that's possible. Forsyth looked at her for a moment. I'll see what I can do. What Forsyth could do, it turned out, was arrange phone calls. Not the same as being present. Nothing like the conversation Kira had imagined in the abstract, if she ever had to have it. But Warwick's mother picked up on the second ring, and she listened without interrupting, and Kira said the things that were true, while Kira's son had been with his unit, that the unit's medic had done everything field medicine allowed, that Dennis Warwick had not died from a failure of care, but from injuries that no equipment and no training could have bridged, and that the circumstances surrounding the deployment were now the subject of a federal investigation that would give her answers she had been owed for 3 years. The silence afterward lasted long enough that Kira thought the call had dropped. Then the woman said, "Were you there?" "Yes," Kira said. Another silence. Was she stopped? Rebuilt the question. Did he know what was happening? Kira thought about what honesty required here. Not comfort. Not the version that was easiest to hear. The truth, which was more complicated. I think at the end, no, she said. The injury was severe. I don't believe he was aware. A breath. Thank you, the woman said, for telling me. Tremblay's family, a younger brother, in his 20s, who had been 17 when his sister died, didn't say thank you. He was angry in the specific way of someone who has been angry for 3 years and has not found an anywhere adequate to put it. He asked questions Kira answered honestly. He said things that were harsh and accurate. He said his sister deserved better. Kira said yes, she did. He said the army had told them nothing. Kira said she knew, and that was part of what the investigation would address. And she meant it, and she said it without cushioning it into something that sounded as like a promise she couldn't personally fulfill. He was quiet at the end. Then, is someone going to be held accountable? Yes, Kira said. I'm going to make sure of it. She meant that too. The press conference, the next morning, was Nakamura's platform, which was appropriate. The senator had the standing, the reach, and the political weight to give the announcement the protection it needed. Kira watched it on a laptop in the field office, standing, the bad coffee machine running in the background. Nakamura was precise and measured. She named the investigation, named the congressional oversight designation, named Meridian Group, and the arrest of its operatives. She did not yet name Okafor that would come through prosecutorial channels. with the timing the federal attorneys controlled. But she named the nature of the allegation, that classified military intelligence had been deliberately suppressed to facilitate the passage of a compromised convoy for financial gain, resulting in the deaths of 7 service members and the wrongful discharge and endangerment of a key witness. The phrase wrongful discharge was in the official record. Kira sat down. Forsyth was watching her from across the table. "How are you?" "Processing." "That's a reasonable response." Kira looked at the laptop screen, at Nakamura at a podium with the flag behind her, at the journalist raising hands, at the machinery of accountability beginning its slow, grinding public operation. It was not clean. It was not satisfying in the way dramatic conclusions are satisfying in sense, where the good thing happens at a moment of perfect narrative timing. It was messy and procedural, and there was a great deal still to come that would be hard. But it was moving, and it was moving in the direction of the thing that had been buried, which meant the thing that had been buried was going to be visible, which meant the people who had built their positions on top of it were going to have the ground shift under them in ways they could not stop with legal filings or political connections or private security. Contractors sent to a hospital corridor in Spokane. Her phone rang. Hargrove General, the administrative line. She answered it. The voice on the other end was the hospital administrator, a man named Garrett Hollis, who had the administrative quality of someone who was very good at managing situations after they had been resolved by other people. He said that the hospital had become aware of the federal investigation and the nature of Kira's Sergeant Mercer's role in it, and that the hospital board had convened an emergency session that morning. And that as a result of that session, he was calling to inform her that the hospital was placing her administrative status under review, pending a formal determination of her scope of practice, given her actual credentials and military background. Under review, she said. It's a standard procedure in situations where I saved 2 patients in your hospital in the same day, she said. Both times without authorization, and both times correctly. She kept her voice even. The review will find that. A pause. The board is also aware that your identity documents may not fully reflect. My name is Emily Mercer, she said. I'm a former Army Ranger combat medic with 14 months of combat deployment experience and 3 years of civilian nursing practice. My medical judgment has been confirmed by 2 post-procedure outcomes and by the surgical attending who was present for both. She paused. Run your review. It'll take you where it takes you. She ended the call. Forsyth had heard enough to understand. The hospital is covering itself. They're doing what institutions do when a situation turns out to be bigger than they thought, Kira said. They're reviewing their exposure. She put the phone down. They'll be fine. Hale will file a report confirming both procedures were appropriate. He told me he would, and he strikes me as someone who does what he says when the alternative is documented inconsistency. You're remarkably calm about potentially losing your nursing position. I've lost positions before. She looked at the laptop, at the press conference, at the grinding machinery of consequence beginning to turn. This time I know why. Okafor's cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office was announced 4 days later. It was not the immunity he had asked for. It was reduced sentencing exposure in exchange for full testimony on the weapons component diversion network, which, as Forsyth had predicted, was larger than 1 general and 1 private security firm. The network involved 2 additional senior officers and a defense procurement official, whose name Kira did not recognize, but whose role in the manifest falsification chain was documented across 3 years of financial transactions that Reyes's team had been assembling for months. The investigation expanded. It was going to take time. That was the truth of it. The institutional reckoning that Kira had been the key to unlocking was not going to resolve in a week or a month. It was going to move through federal courts and congressional hearings and DoD review panels, and going to be contested at every stage by attorneys with resources and by men who had spent careers building this specific kind of position that is designed to be difficult to dismantle. But it was moving. Kira was in the field office when Forsyth came in with a physical document, an actual purpose document, the kind the military still used for certain formal processes, and set it on the table in front of her. "Your service record," Forsyth said. "The original. The classified notation has been removed. The administrative separation has been reclassified from voluntary to wrongful, with full back benefits eligibility, pending the formal hearing outcome." Kira looked at the document. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way she had looked at Devereaux in the trauma bay, with full attention, no performance, just the plain recognition of what the thing was. Her name on the document was Emily Mercer, Sergeant, United States Army, Ranger qualified, with a service record that included 4 deployments, a soldier's medal, and a commendation for battlefield medical intervention under fire. 14 months of combat, 11 casualties treated, 9 survivors. She picked it up. "There's something else," Forsyth said. The something else was a second document beneath the service record. This one had a different header: Congressional Office of Oversight, Senate Armed Services Committee. And at the bottom, a request. Formal, procedural, the language of official process, but a request. Senator Nakamura's office was asking Emily Mercer to appear before the Senate Armed Services Committee to provide direct testimony on the Fort Lanner deployment and the subsequent cover-up on the record in open session. Public testimony, not a deposition in a gray room with a federal stenographer. Public testimony in front of cameras and committee members, and a record that would be available to every family member of every soldier who had died in that valley, and every person who had any reason to want to know what had actually happened. Kira read the request. She read it again. Forsyth said, "You don't have to decide today." "I know." Kira put the document down beside the service record. She looked at both of them on the table, the military record with the classified notation removed, and the congressional request. The 2 documents that represented the end of 3 years of a particular kind of existence and the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she now recognized: Devereaux, from the secure facility. "Saw the press conference. You're not invisible anymore." She thought about how to answer that for a moment. Then she thought about the East Wing Recovery Corridor and the assignment board with Langston penciled in, and the broken latch on the locker room stall, and 91 mornings of absorbing the hard work nobody else wanted while knowing, in the place below, the place she looked at directly, that the invisibility was both a shelter and a slow damage. She picked up the congressional request. "Tell the senator's office, yes," she said. She said it without hesitation, and then immediately the full weight of what she had just agreed to arrived not as doubt, not as retreat, but as the specific gravity of a decision made with open eyes, which always lands differently than a decision made while looking away. And then Forsyth's phone rang, and Forsyth answered it, and what crossed her face was not alarm, but the look of someone receiving information that reorders priorities. She put the call on hold and looked at Kira. "Okafor's cooperation agreement is being contested," Forsyth said. "His attorneys filed a motion 2 hours ago claiming the communications chain evidence was improperly obtained. The federal judge is reviewing. Can they get it thrown out?" "The judge is reviewing," Forsyth said, "which means it's not automatic. But if the routing code evidence is excluded, the documentation of his direct involvement in the convoy order goes from definitive to circumstantial," Kira said. Yes, she sat with that. The building that had been visible for 4 days, the architecture of consequence and accountability, it was still standing. But someone had found a load-bearing point and was applying pressure to it, and the outcome of that pressure was not yet determined. "Who filed the motion?" she asked. Forsyth looked at her phone, at a name on the screen. The lead attorney is Marcus Holt. He represents 3 senior defense officials and has argued 7 cases before the National Security Appellate Court in the last 4 years. She paused. He's very good. So are we, Kira said, and the we landed in the sentence without her planning it, the word of someone who has, in the past 4 days, moved from operating alone to operating as part of something larger, and felt the difference in the way she said the simplest things. Forsyth looked at the motion on her screen, then at Kira, then back at the screen. If the routing code is excluded and the operative orders are challenged on chain of custody grounds, Okafor's legal team pivots back to the full contest, which means the testimony becomes the center of everything. My testimony, Kira said. Yes. Then make sure it's ironclad, she said. Every element I gave in the deposition, I want it cross-referenced against every document we have. Every date, every routing code, every personnel transfer. I want the testimony to be self-supporting even if the communications chain is excluded. She held Forsyth's gaze. He built 3 years of protection. I've been building the answer to it for the same amount of time. Let him bring his attorney. Forsyth looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and picked up her phone and started making calls. Kira sat at the table with the 2 documents in front of her, the service record, the congressional request, and the bad coffee going cold to her right, and the gray walls of the field office around her, and the full complicated weight of what was still ahead settling into her, the way she had let things settle when she needed to carry them rather than put them down. Outside, the federal process was moving. The legal contest was sharpening. Nakamura's office was preparing for a hearing. Devereaux was in a secure facility with his testimony documented. The soldiers' families had been told the truth for the first time in 3 years. And Warren Okafor, who had built his career on the certainty that a 28-year-old combat medic would stay disappeared, had just discovered that she had not. What he did not yet know was what was on the second hard drive. The one Kira had not given Forsyth. The one still locked in the combination case that was not in the field office, not in her apartment, not in any location connected to her current identity or her previous ones. The one that contained the recording. The recording existed because Emily Mercer had been 28 years old and frightened, and had still, even in that state, been thorough. She had not planned to make it. On the morning of the 14th, when she had gone to the communications tent for the supply form, she had been carrying the small digital recorder she used to document patient and specimen assessments in the field, a habit she'd developed in her first deployment because written notes in a combat zone were unreliable and voice records were faster. It was clipped to the inside of her jacket. She had not thought to turn it off before she approached the tent. When she heard the voices and stopped, she had been still enough that the ambient recording caught what was said. She had discovered the recording 4 days after the ambush, transferring her patient notes, and had listened to it once, in the dark, with headphones, and had understood immediately what she was holding and how dangerous it was to hold it. She had copied it to the second drive. She had kept the original on the recorder until the recorder's battery finally failed 2 years later. She had carried the drive through 6 cities and packed it separately from everything else, in a location she had never told anyone about, because the thing about evidence is that its value depends entirely on its integrity, and integrity requires that the evidence exist independently of the person who holds it, unreachable by the people who want it gone. She called Forsyth at 7 in the morning. I have something, she said. You need to come get it. The silence in the field office when Forsyth listened to the recording was a different quality of silence than the room had held before. It was the silence of people who have been building a case around the shapes of something they couldn't see and have just had the shape filled in, completely, with the original thing itself. Okafor's voice was clear. The recording quality was imperfect. There was ambient wind noise, the occasional sound of movement, the compression of a small field recorder, doing its best with what it had, but the voice was identifiable, and the words were not ambiguous. Acceptable exposure. And then, More specifically, more damning than anything the communications contained, a reference to the cargo by its actual contents, not by the falsified manifest description. Decommissioned ordnance components. The phrase he used, the phrase that connected him not just to the convoy order, but to knowledge of what the convoy was actually carrying. Reyes listened to it twice. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the specific posture of someone recalibrating the scope of what they have. This makes the routing code motion irrelevant, she said. His attorneys can exclude the communications chain from digital records. They cannot exclude a contemporaneous audio recording made by a witness who was present. His attorneys will challenge it, Forsyth said. They'll challenge everything, Reyes said. But a voice recording with ambient environmental markers, consistent with the location, the date, the personnel present with the witness on record identifying the voice and the context. She looked at Kira. This goes into the hearing. It goes into the hearing, and it doesn't come back out. Kira thought about the thing she had carried for 3 years without looking at directly. The way you carry something in a bag you never open because you know what's inside, and the knowing is enough without the seeing. She thought about the morning she had stood outside a canvas wall and heard a general discuss the death of soldiers the way you discuss an acceptable weather delay, as a cost, not a tragedy, as math, not people. She thought about Dennis Warwick's mother asking, was he aware? Make sure it reaches the families, Kira said, not just the legal record. The families need to hear not the recording itself, but what it means. That their people were not lost to the chaos of war. That someone made a decision, and that decision has a name. Reyes looked at her. That's part of the congressional process. I know. Make sure it's a real part, not a procedural notification. She held Reyes's gaze. These families have been given bureaucratic language for 3 years. They deserve a person sitting across from them, telling them the truth. Reyes was quiet for a moment. I'll personally handle the family notifications. Thank you, Kira said. The legal motion challenging the communications chain evidence collapsed within 48 hours of the recording's formal submission to the federal investigation. Holt Okafor's lead attorney withdrew the challenge without public explanation, which was the attorney's way of acknowledging that the challenge had been rendered pointless by something he had not known existed. The cooperation agreement was reinstated. Okafor's testimony before the federal grand jury began on a Monday morning, 12 days after Kira had walked back into Hargrove General and stood against the wall of a trauma bay. She was not in the room for the grand jury. She was not supposed to know what he said. She knew enough from what Forsyth told her afterward. He confirmed the convoy order. He confirmed knowledge of the cargo contents. He named 2 additional officers in the procurement networks and a civilian defense official who had brokered the arrangement for the weapons components. He said, when asked directly, that he had not anticipated the number of casualties the ambush would produce. Forsyth told her this last detail with a specific expression not discussed, which would have been understandable, but something more tired. The expression of someone who has heard too many powerful people describe the deaths of soldiers calculés as miscalculations, rather than murders. He didn't anticipate the number, Kira said. No. What number did he anticipate? He didn't specify. She sat with that. She did not spend long with it, because spending long with it was not useful. And she had learned across 3 years. And now the discipline of putting things in the correct place rather than the place they wanted to go, which was everywhere, all the time, with full weight. The number he had anticipated didn't matter. 7 soldiers had died. 2 of them she had knelt beside in the dark. All 7 of them had families who had been told the wrong thing for 3 years. What mattered now was the hearing. The Senate's Armed Services Committee convened 6 weeks later in Washington, in a room that was larger and more formally arranged than any room Kira had been in during the previous month of field offices and gray walls. She sat at the witness table in a dark jacket and looked at the committee members arranged in the tiered seating that committees use to remind witnesses of the vertical relationship between the asking and the answering. She did not feel small. She had thought she might, and she had prepared for it as a possibility, the way she prepared for possibilities that had a chance of being real. But the room was just a room, and the senators were just people, and she had spent 14 months in conditions where rooms were tense, and people were bleeding, and the vertical relationship was between the decision and the consequence, not between the powerful and the less powerful. She stated her name, Emily Mercer, Sergeant, United States Army, Ranger qualified. Former combat medic, Fort Lanner deployment, 3 years prior. She said it without the pause. She had been carrying around that name for 3 years. It landed in the room and stayed there, attached to her, the way a name should be. The questioning ran 4 hours. She answered everything. She answered the questions she had anticipated, and the ones she hadn't. The ones that came from committee members who were genuinely trying to understand, and the ones that came from members who were trying to find a version of events that softened the institutional implications. She answered those last ones with particular care, not defensively, but precisely, because precision in the face of a softening question is its own form of resistance. When a senator from a southern state asked whether the administrative separation from service might have reflected performance might have reflected legitimate concerns rather than deliberate suppression, she said, "The administrative review that was used to separate me from service was later determined to have no supporting documentation in the official record. The separation has been formally reclassified as wrongful. Those two facts answer your question more completely than I can." The senator moved to the next question. When asked to identify the voice on the recording, she did. When asked to confirm the date and the context, she did. When asked whether she had any doubt about what she had heard in the communications tent on the morning of March 14th, 3 years ago, she said, "No." One word, no hesitation. The room held it. Devereaux testified the following day. He spoke about the inquiry he had been running for 8 months, every channel through which he had tried to find the medic who had saved his life, every point at which that inquiry had been shut down, every name that had appeared in the closure. He was a Navy captain with combat service and the specific credibility of someone who has nothing to prove and is testifying anyway, because the alternative is living with what he knows. He said, at one point, when a committee member asked why he had persisted for 8 months against institutional resistance, "Because she kept me alive in a ditch in Afghanistan. The least I could do was not let people erase her." The room did something quiet with that. Not applause, it was a hearing, not a performance, but a quality of stillness that carries weight. Okafor was indicted on 7 counts, which the federal prosecutor announced at a press conference. Kira did not attend because she was at Hargrove General, where she had gone because it was a Tuesday and she had patients. She had returned to the hospital 10 days after the field office. After a conversation with the administrator that was different from the one they had on the phone. Hollis had called it a clarification meeting. What it actually was, the hospital reviewing what it had and deciding that a nurse with Kira's, with Emily's actual credentials and track record, was a significantly more valuable asset than it had treated her as being when she was just a floor nurse who absorbed hard assignments. Hale had filed the report, as he said he would. Both procedures confirmed appropriate and correctly executed. He had also, without being asked, attached a supplementary note to the report describing her diagnostic speed and accuracy in terms that would look significant to anyone assessing scope of practice. It was not generous exactly, it was accurate, and Hale was a man who was accurate when accuracy served his integrity. But it was there, in the record, unambiguous. She had been offered a formal position as senior trauma consultant, pending the completion of a credential review that would incorporate her military medical training into her civilian licensure profile. The credential review was not standard. It was a process that had required the hospital board and a state medical authority to work through a framework that didn't cleanly exist for someone with her specific background. It had taken 4 weeks and considerable institutional effort. She had accepted the position without ceremony because the work was the thing, not the ceremony around it. On the Tuesday she was at the hospital when Okafor's indictment was announced, she was teaching. The hospital had asked her to do this formally as a structured component of her new role, and she had agreed because it was the part of the new position she had not expected to want and did. She had 12 residents in a trauma simulation room, and she was walking them through a compartment syndrome assessment, the same assessment she had made in the trauma bay 7 weeks earlier, with a Navy captain's arm going black on the table and a surgeon telling her to leave. She did not tell them the story. It was not a teaching story. It was a teaching method, the way her hands moved, the landmarks she identified by touch, the sequence of assessment that moved from observation to palpation to diagnosis, without the gap that happened when you were waiting for imaging to confirm what your hands were already telling you. The machines confirm, she said to the room. Your hands are faster. In the time it takes to get imaging, you can have an assessment. Use both, but don't wait for the machine to tell you what the patient is already saying. A resident named Yolanda, who had been on the trauma bay on the day it happened, and had seen the arm turn from black to pink, asked, "How do you stay calm when you're making a decision that fast?" Emily thought about this. She thought about it honestly, because the dishonest version you train until it becomes automatic was true, but incomplete. You don't always, she said. Sometimes you're scared, and you do it anyway. The doing and the feeling aren't the same thing. You can be frightened and accurate at the same time. She looked at the room. If you wait to feel calm before you act, you'll lose patients that didn't need to be lost. Feel whatever you feel. Do the work. Yolanda wrote that down. The sentencing hearing for Okafor was 4 months after the indictment, which was faster than federal proceedings typically moved, and was the result of a cooperation agreement that his attorneys had negotiated aggressively in exchange for his testimony against the two additional officers and the civilian procurement official. He received 8 years on the primary conspiracy charge, with concurrent sentences on the obstruction and fraud counts. The 2 additional officers received 6 and 5 years, respectively. The civilian official, who had cooperated first and most completely, received a reduced sentence and a permanent bar from federal contracting work. Meridian Group's federal contracts were terminated. Its operating license was suspended pending a DoD investigation into its activities across multiple clients. The firm did not survive the investigation. Emily was not in the courthouse for the sentencing. She was in Spokane, at the hospital, finishing a shift. She read the outcome on her phone at the nurse's station. And Garrett, who had become something adjacent to a colleague, in the way that people become colleagues when they have been through something unusual together without having planned, to saw her face and said, "Good news or bad?" "Good," she said. He nodded and went back to his documentation. She put the phone in her pocket. She thought, briefly and without ceremony, about a valley in Afghanistan and 2 soldiers and a general who had used the word acceptable about the cost of human lives. He was going to prison, not because she had done everything right from the beginning, she hadn't. Not because the system had worked cleanly, it hadn't. Because she had carried something for 3 years, without fully putting it down, and because a Navy captain with a compromised lung had found her across a crowded hospital room through the sedation and the pain, and because she had gone back into the trauma bay when she could have kept walking, and because she had said a name out loud in a conference room when the cost of saying it had finally become lower than the cost of saying it. The weight she put down was not all of it at once. That was not how it worked. She knew this. She had watched enough people come back from things to know that recovery was not an event, but a direction, not a destination, but a practice. Not the moment you stopped carrying something, but the accumulation of days in which you carried it less. She was carrying it less. 6 months after the hearing, there was a ceremony. She had not asked for it, and had, in fact, tried to redirect the conversation when Forsyth had mentioned it, on the grounds that ceremonies were not the point and her time was better used elsewhere. Forsyth had said, with some directness, the families of the fallen soldiers need a public acknowledgement. That's not about you. Show up. She showed up. It was not large a meeting room at a federal building. Families in chairs, some military presence, some congressional staff, Nakamura's office, represented by Patterson, who had turned out to be someone she respected for his efficiency and his absence of pretension. Devereaux was there, out of the secure facility, now, moving carefully because the chest tube recovery had been longer than anticipated, and his left arm was in a brace for ongoing vascular rehabilitation. He looked better than he had in a hospital bed. He looked like himself. Hale came. She had not expected this, and it surprised her, and when she saw him across the room, she registered that it took a specific kind of character to show up to something you were not required to attend as a form of acknowledgement. He saw her see him and gave a small, direct nod. She returned it. Weston was not there, which was fine. Weston had called her, once, in the weeks after everything became public, and said, "I underutilized you. I want you to know I'm aware of that." It was characteristically abbreviated and characteristic honest, and Kira Emily had said, "I know. It's done," and they had moved forward from it in the pragmatic way of two people who have work to do and limited appetite for extended emotional accounting. The ceremony was not long. There were formal remarks. The families received documents that formalized the military's acknowledgement of the circumstances of the deployment. 2 family members spoke. Warwick's mother spoke for 6 minutes about her son, not about the investigation, not about the indictment about her son, his particular laugh, the specific way he called her every Sunday, regardless of where he was deployed. It was the most important thing said in the room all day. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she stood at the front of the room and looked at the assembled faces, the families, the officials, Devereaux, Hale at the back, and said what she had been preparing, which was not a speech but a statement of fact delivered with the directness of someone would run out of patience for the performance of things and only had room for the actual things. She said that 7 soldiers had died in circumstances that should not have existed. That the people responsible for creating those circumstances were now facing the legal consequences of those decisions. That 2 of the soldiers, Warwick and Tremblay, had received the best care available in the field that night, which had not been enough because the injuries were beyond what field care could address, and that was a fact she had lived with and would continue to live with, and that it was not the same as a failure. She said, "I ran for 3 years because I was frightened and I was young, and the machinery of cover-up is very effective against a person operating alone. I don't apologize for surviving the way I did, but I want the families in this room to know that I should have been louder sooner, and that the time between what happened and this room is time I'm going to spend making sure the systems that allowed it don't stay intact." She stopped. A woman in the second row, Tremblay's mother, a small woman in her 60s who had driven 14 hours to be here, looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You stayed alive. That's why we're here." Emily Mercer did not have an answer to that. She accepted it, which was harder. She went back to work on a Thursday. This was the fact of it, in the end. Not the ceremony, not the indictment, not the congressional hearing with its formal record. The work was the shape of what came after. She was a trauma consultant at Hargrove General in Spokane, Washington. She was 32 years old, and her name was Emily Mercer, and her service record was accurate now. All of it. The citations and the deployment history, and the reclassified separation, and the commendation that had been buried in the classified notation and was now visible in the same record as everything else. She taught on Tuesday afternoons. She consulted on trauma cases that came in through the ER. which happened more than the East Wing recovery section did, because the hospital had correctly identified where her skills were best applied. She still documented carefully. She still arrived before she needed to. She still had the habit of noting exits. Some habits are not damage. Some habits are just how you are. Devereaux texted her occasionally. Not often he was back in active duty, desk assignment, while the arm finished its rehabilitation, but active. He sent her articles sometimes, the kind about military medical reform or battlefield care protocols. She read them. She sent back comments when she had them, which was often. Hale consulted her formally now. He did it without the tilted chin. He had not become a different person. He was still exacting and somewhat difficult, and prone to the specific arrogance of surgeons who are genuinely excellent at their work. But he had become a person who consulted her, which was its own kind of shift, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Garrett passed his boards. She wrote him a reference. She was in the break room one afternoon, eating a sandwich that she had not eaten the first half of at lunch, because a patient's drain had required unexpected attention, when Yolanda came in and poured coffee and sat across from her. "Can I ask you something?" Yolanda said. "Sure. The thing you said in the simulation room." About being scared and accurate at the same time. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Is it still both? Or does it get to just one eventually? Emily thought about the lobby of the hospital 7 weeks ago, with the glass door between her and a running vehicle with its lights off. She thought about the field office and the gray walls and the deposition camera. She thought about sitting at a witness table and saying no to a question about doubt, and the way that no had come from the same place. All the accurate things came from not the absence of fear, but the decision, made daily and sometimes hourly and sometimes in the space between one breath and the next, that the fear was not the last word. "Both," she said. "It stays both." Yolanda nodded. Wrote nothing down this time, just took it in. Emily finished her sandwich. She went back to work. There was a post-surgical patient in room 11 whose drain output had been inconsistent all day, and 2 residents she needed to check in with before the end of shift, and a trauma protocol review she had been asked to contribute to by the hospital's quality committee, which she was going to do because the protocol had 3 points in it that would get someone killed if they were left as written. There was work. There was always work. This had always been true. Through 6 cities and 4 jobs and 91 days of absorbing the hard assignments in the section nobody wanted, through a valley in Afghanistan and a communications tent and a broken locker latch in the stall. With the broken latch, the work had always been there, waiting for the moment when the person doing it could do it under her own name. She had that now. She had not gotten her old life back. The old life had been taken apart piece by people who found her useful as a silence, and you don't rebuild a demolished thing, you build something different in its place, with better materials and clearer sight lines, and the specific knowledge that comes from having seen exactly how the first version failed. What she had built was this: her name on a door, her record intact, her work visible to people who now understood what they were looking at when they watched her move through a trauma bay. It was not perfect. Nothing she had ever held was perfect. But it was hers, fully and finally and without the weight of a secret underneath it, pressing upward against everything she touched. She walked out of the break room and back into the corridor, and the East Wing was doing what it always did: monitors, voices, the particular organized urgency of a place where people came when they were at their worst and left, if the work was done well, returning towards something better. She had been the invisible nurse in this corridor. She had also been the one who saved the arm. She had been frightened and accurate and alone, and she had carried the thing carefully enough that when the moment came, it was still intact, and it was enough. Nobody who looked at her now, the residents tracking her movement through the ward, Garrett at the station giving her the chart she had asked for, the attending who stopped to ask her opinion on a vascular presentation in Bay 3, nobody who looked at her now would have called her invisible. Not because she had changed the way she moved, or started performing these the way she moved, stopped the authority she carried, or stopped being the person who showed up early and absorbed the hard work without complaint. She had always been exactly this person. They just knew it now.